Hi everybody. Tonight I invite you to lean back, close your eyes, and drift with me into a story that lingers on the edge of shadowed history. A story that whispers of an ancient land, of peoples whose songs once echoed across vast forests, rolling plains, and silent mountains. This is a journey into the mystery behind the extinction of Native Americans, a tale woven with whispers of forgotten villages, silent trails, and a question that hums like a distant drum in the quiet night. How did so many lives, so many rich and vivid cultures, fade into the mists of time? As you settle in, I want you to picture the vastness of the American continents before the wind carried ships with white sails to its shores. Picture rivers running like silver serpents, great bison herds darkening the plains, and ancient forests standing tall against the northern skies. Here lived nations of people whose worlds were shaped by the land, by the spirits they honored, and by the stories they passed from elder to child beside fires that flickered beneath starry skies. Our story begins long before the first European footstep pressed into soft earth, before treaties, before wars, before smallpox blankets and broken promises. This was a world thrumming with life, a tapestry of vibrant tribes, each with their own traditions, languages, and wisdom. The first chapters of their extinction were not written in gunpowder or conquest. They were whispered by unseen hands of fate, subtle as a change in the wind. Imagine, if you will, a lone traveller from across the sea, a sailor who steps ashore after a long and harrowing voyage. In his veins runs the blood of old-world cities. And within his breath, perhaps an unseen, silent passenger. The arrival of Europeans brought much more than ships and swords. With them came diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, silent, invisible enemies that crept ahead of the explorers, often racing far inland long before the first colonizers set eyes on the native villages. Let me take you to the year 1520. Hernán Cortés, the famed Spanish conquistador, had been battling the mighty Aztec Empire. Among his men, a slave from Africa, who had been brought across the Atlantic, fell ill, his skin erupting with the telltale sores of smallpox. From that single spark, an inferno of disease ignited. Within a few short years, the great city of Tenochtitlan, home to hundreds of thousands, lay still and silent. The streets that once rang with vibrant life became graveyards. Entire families vanished within days. The disease moved faster than swords, swifter than armies. But this was just the beginning. The path of these invisible enemies stretched far beyond the conquest of the Aztecs. The diseases leapt from traveller to villager, carried by breath, touch, and trade. In North America, villages along the coastlines began to empty. English explorers in the early 1600s would later find abandoned settlements, their fires long cold, their people gone. Captain John Smith, known for his role in the Virginia colony, wrote of meeting tribes whose numbers had already been decimated. They spoke in hushed tones of a great sickness that came from the east, a sickness they did not understand nor know how to fight. Imagine the quiet terror of entire families falling ill within hours of each other, the elders, the hunters, the mothers, the children. The healers, skilled in tending wounds and known illnesses, stood helpless before the invisible plague that withered bodies and stole breath. Picture a morning in a coastal village where the sun rises over silent lodges, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and sickness. A single survivor wanders the empty paths, calling out for loved ones who will never answer. This was a slow, silent apocalypse, one that moved unseen, leaving devastation in its wake. The mystery, you see, is not simply why Native American populations declined, but why they declined so swiftly, so devastatingly. The diseases were a force of nature, yes, but the full story, the deeper story, is far more tangled. Why were the native peoples so vulnerable? Why did the arrival of European pathogens have such an explosive effect, while Europeans themselves had grown resistant over centuries? The answer lies hidden in the deep past, in a divergence of worlds, in millennia of separation that shaped two continents in profoundly different ways. As we wander through this tale together, I want you to listen not just with your ears, but with your heart. This is not a story of villains and victims alone. It is a tale of human fragility, of unintended consequences, and of ancient patterns woven into the very fabric of life. Tonight, this first part closes with a single haunting image, a shoreline where a lone canoe drifts aimlessly, Its paddler slumped silent against the gunwale, taken by a sickness he could not name, carrying away with him the first whispers of a tragedy yet to unfold fully. And in the stillness, as night draws its velvet curtain, we leave this part of the story with questions suspended in the quiet air. What forces lay behind this silent extinction? And who were the souls that vanished into the shadows of history before they could even tell their stories? Rest now, and when you are ready, I will take you further along the winding path of this forgotten mystery. In the gentle hush of a world untouched by engines or iron rails, vast forests stretched as far as the eye could see, their branches swaying softly to the rhythm of ancient winds. This was the land known to the native peoples long before foreign sails marred the horizon. Here, time moved with the seasons, and life followed the patient cycle of earth and sky. The story I now tell you slips quietly into a chapter of that land's memory, a chapter hidden beneath layers of moss and silence. After the first silent wave of sickness swept across the shores, whispers began to thread through the forests and rivers of a shadow no one could see. The Wampanoag people, who dwelled by the eastern coasts in what is now Massachusetts, were among the first to face the mystery. It was around the year 1616. Without warning, a sickness came as silent as dewfall. They called it the Great Dying. Villages that once rang with laughter and song fell silent within weeks. Elders who held the stories of their people, mothers who tended the fires, hunters strong as the forest bears, all fell to an invisible hand. It was said that entire bands disappeared, the earth swallowing their voices forever. English sailors arriving just a few years later would find deserted villages along the coast, fields overgrown, canoes adrift on still waters, and strange symbols carved into trees as if left behind by desperate hands. These newcomers spoke little of the vanished lives they found. To them, the empty lands were a gift of providence, a clearing of the way for their colonial dreams. But beneath the surface, questions flickered like candlelight in a dark room. Why did the sickness come with such fury? Some believed it was a curse. Others thought it a punishment from spirits wronged. Among the Wampanoag, it was whispered that a dark wind had come from across the sea, carried by pale strangers with unknowable ways. The truth, as we know now, was far more intricate, a woven tapestry of fate and nature's blind indifference. In Europe, centuries of dense city life, poor sanitation, and constant human contact had hardened immune systems against countless diseases. Cities teemed with rats, lice, and illnesses that passed like wildfire. Those who survived inherited resistance in their blood, a quiet, invisible armor. Across the ocean, the native peoples lived in smaller communities, scattered across vast lands. Their ways were clean, their lives more isolated. They had never known smallpox, nor measles, nor the creeping death of influenza. Their immune systems were strangers to these invaders. When the diseases arrived, the native bodies stood unguarded, like open doors to a raging storm. Imagine a village elder, sitting beside a crackling fire, weaving stories of ancestors, unaware that within his breath stirred the seeds of a foreign illness. By the time the first fever struck, it was too late. The sickness raced from lodge to lodge, moving with a speed and cruelty that no healer's wisdom could match. The symptoms often began with a fever, a heat that seemed to boil the blood. Then came the sores, painful and angry, bursting across skin once vibrant with health. Eyes clouded, breathing grew shallow, and within days even the strongest warriors lay still beneath animal hide blankets. Sometimes entire villages perished within a single moon's passing. And yet it was not only the disease itself that unraveled the fabric of these societies. The impact ran deeper, cutting into the very heart of native life. When the elders fell, so too did the living memory of the people, their myths, their histories, their sacred rites known only to a few. The oral tradition, passed carefully from tongue to ear over generations, crumbled in silence. With the hunters gone, there were no hands to bring meat to the fires. With the women ill, there were no weavers for the baskets, no hands to tend the crops. The web of life, so delicately balanced, unraveled thread by fragile thread. Imagine standing on the edge of a forest at dawn, watching as smoke rises from a village of the dead, the air thick with mourning. The silence would hang heavy, as if the earth itself wept. And yet, amid the ashes of despair, small sparks of survival flickered. Some tribes moved deeper into the forests, seeking refuge from both sickness and the strange newcomers from across the sea. They carried with them the faintest embers of their people's spirit, hoping against hope that distance would shield them. But the invisible enemy followed still. This slow, creeping extinction was unlike anything the native peoples had known. Battles they understood, conflict between tribes or against invaders, was part of life. But this silent death stole into their homes unchallenged, unopposed. And so, even before the first true wars of conquest began, vast regions of the Americas stood emptied, their people vanished like morning mist beneath the sun. European settlers would later marvel at the abundance of free land, calling it virgin wilderness, a term blind to the echoes of the lives once lived upon it. Fields were ripe, not because nature was generous, but because generations of native hands had tended them. The newcomers saw opportunity where there had been tragedy. And so, with each ship that arrived, the silent hand of extinction tightened its grip a little more. But deeper questions remained unanswered, questions that ripple through history even now. Why did the disease spread faster in some regions than in others? Was it merely chance, or did hidden currents in trade and travel guide its path? And what of the first native groups who met these foreign strangers? Were their choices, their fates, a thread in the web that bound the continents in this dark dance of life and death? In the stillness of this second chapter, I ask you to hold those questions close, letting them settle like soft snow upon your thoughts. For the mystery is only beginning to reveal its shape. A story of sorrow, yes, but also of endurance, of human spirit shadowed by fate's unseen hand. And as the night deepens, we drift onward toward the heart of this silent catastrophe in search of answers hidden beneath centuries of quiet. The morning sun rose gently over the eastern woodlands, casting long shadows across the dew-kissed grass. In those silent forests, where once the songs of native tribes wove through the trees, there now remained only echoes, a soft sigh of a world unraveling in ways no one could foresee. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching. As the years slipped quietly past, the story of extinction deepened, its roots creeping further beneath the surface of the known world. The first waves of sickness had shattered countless villages along the coasts, but now, like ripples in a still pond, the silent plague began to reach inland, far beyond the gaze of the first European settlers. The mystery that puzzled even the keenest observers of the time was how the sickness spread so swiftly to regions untouched by foreign hands. In the vast Mississippi River Valley, great mound-building cultures had flourished long before any white sails darkened their horizons. These were the descendants of the Mississippian peoples, builders of Cahokia, weavers of intricate trade networks that spanned thousands of miles. By the time European explorers wandered through the heartlands in the 1540s, led by men such as Hernando de Soto, they found a land strangely altered. Villages once bustling with life now stood in quiet decay. Fields lay fallow, the earth choked by wild grasses reclaiming their hold. The people they did encounter seemed fewer, wary, shadowed by a quiet sorrow. De Soto himself would write of encountering vast, powerful chiefdoms, and then, scarcely a generation later, those same societies had faded into whispers, their cities swallowed by earth and time. How could such a vast network of cultures crumble so swiftly? The answer, fragile and chilling, lay in the silent travelers who moved along the ancient trade routes, traders, emissaries, wanderers, unknowing carriers of death. As they followed the winding rivers, the forest trails and the hidden paths between distant villages, they bore within them invisible seeds of European diseases. Without realizing it, they became the dark messengers of a fate they could neither see nor comprehend. The sickness did not always strike with the same face. In some villages, it came as a fevered coughing, burning like wildfire through families. In others, it arrived as sores that devoured the skin, or as a wasting illness that hollowed the body within weeks. There were whispers among the people, of dark spirits awakened, of curses called down by angry gods. Elders spoke of omens in the skies, of strange lights and unnatural storms. The fear became a living thing, curling its cold fingers into the hearts of survivors. And yet, the spread of disease alone does not tell the full story. Behind the veil of sickness lay another force, one quieter but equally devastating, the collapse of native social and spiritual structures. Many native societies were built upon intricate webs of kinship, alliances, and deeply held spiritual beliefs. The chief was not merely a leader in battle, but a keeper of ceremonial rites, a guide between the earthly world and the spirit realms. When disease struck, it often claimed the elders, the shamans, the spiritual leaders first, those most exposed through their healing work and care of the sick. With their passing, the thread of tradition began to fray. Sacred ceremonies were forgotten, alliances broke under the strain of mourning and fear, and entire clans fell into disarray. What happens to a people when not only their bodies fall, but their very identity is cast into shadow? Imagine a circle of mourners, gathered around a shaman's empty lodge, knowing no other among them holds the sacred chants to guide the souls of the dead. Imagine the fear that stirs when a community realizes its wisdom keepers are gone, and with them, the fragile map of who they are. As the years passed, isolation became both a shield and a curse. Some bands moved deeper into the forests, cutting ties with distant allies to avoid the creeping death. But this retreat fractured ancient trade networks, weakened alliances, and left communities vulnerable, not only to disease but to the encroaching foreign powers whose hunger for land and resources knew no bounds. And into this fragile world stepped the explorers, the settlers, and the soldiers, finding lands that seemed curiously emptied, unaware or uncaring of the silent storms that had swept through before them. It is a haunting image, is it not? A land made ghostly silent, not by sword or fire, but by the unseen hands of fate, a stage cleared by death for the entrance of new powers. And yet, even this is but a single thread in the greater tapestry. Because alongside the physical extinction came something more insidious, a slow erosion of the native people's ability to resist, to unite, to hold firm against the foreign tide. The diseases shattered not only bodies, but the invisible bonds of trust and tradition that tied communities together. Fear bred suspicion. Villages that might once have welcomed each other in times of hardship now turned inward, wary of strangers who might carry the sickness upon their skin. And so, the great nations of the Americas entered an age of quiet unraveling, not with a sudden collapse, not with a dramatic fall, but with a slow fading, like a song whose notes grow softer with each passing verse until only silence remains. By the time larger waves of colonization arrived, the groundwork of extinction had already been laid, not by war, not by conquest, but by a force none had seen coming. And yet, the deepest mystery remains untouched still. Why was there no resistance? Not of arms, but of survival. Why did some groups disappear entirely, while others lingered on the edges of history's shadow? In the next quiet chapter, we will follow those faint trails, the stories of the survivors, the few who held on to the fragile threads of identity amid the storm. For even in the heart of darkness, the ember of human spirit flickers still, waiting, hoping. And the night stretches softly onward, carrying us deeper into a story that still hums beneath the quiet soil of forgotten lands. The wind moved softly across the high plains, bending the grasses in gentle waves beneath a wide, endless sky. Beneath that dome of soft blue, in lands that would one day be called the American Midwest, the heartbeat of ancient nations still echoed faintly. The slow fade of the Native American peoples was not a single sweeping catastrophe, but a patient, relentless unraveling. A silent snowfall burying what once had been a vibrant living world. By the early 1600s, entire regions of North America had begun to change, not by conquest of sword or musket, but by the invisible hand of disease and the slow, aching collapse of societies left hollow by its touch. And yet, even as death stalked the villages and forests, there were those who survived, the embers among the ashes. These survivors were not always the strongest, nor the mightiest warriors. Often, they were the few spared by fate's unseen choice. A child, a lone hunter, a widow left to bury her family beneath the sacred earth. They gathered in small, fragile bands, often too small to sustain the complex social structures that had defined their people for generations. These groups, scattered and wary, became the silent witnesses of a dying world. In the northern woodlands, where the Iroquois Confederacy once flourished, the story took a curious turn. The Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, stood as one of the rare exceptions in a continent shadowed by loss. Formed long before European contact, the Confederacy bound together 5 nations in a council of peace and mutual protection. This unity, fragile as it was, became a shield against both external enemies and the creeping despair that disease brought. Yet even among the Iroquois, the silent hand of extinction left its mark. The number of villages grew fewer, the gatherings smaller. Ceremonial fires, once bright with song and dance, burned low, but they burned still. The strength of their confederacy allowed them to absorb the shattered remnants of neighboring tribes, offering refuge to those with no home, no kin. In this way, the Haudenosaunee became a living archive of survival, an ember smouldering in a land growing cold. Further west, on the Great Prairies, the Sioux, the Crow, and the Cheyenne roamed lands less touched by the earliest waves of sickness. The vast openness acted as a barrier, slowing the relentless march of invisible death. Here, life moved to the rhythm of the bison herds, and the sicknesses that had crippled the coastal and woodland tribes arrived later, their fury somewhat softened by time and distance. But arrival was inevitable. When the diseases did come, they spread like ghost fires, silent, swift, and merciless. A single trading party might return from distant contact, carrying the death that would consume a village. The buffalo hunts, gatherings of clans, and the great seasonal movements of the plains peoples became moments of danger rather than celebration. And so the great nations of the plains, though later touched, were not spared. They too began to fracture, to diminish, to fade beneath the twin shadows of disease and encroaching settlers. Yet, like the Iroquois, some adapted, not by growing stronger in arms, but by weaving the threads of different shattered groups into new forms of identity. In the forests of the Great Lakes, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Ottawa forged fragile alliances, turning their focus to resilience rather than resistance. Their stories became quieter, their rituals more intimate, whispered around smaller fires. Yet they endured, holding the threads of memory in their careful hands. But endurance came at a cost. The spiritual heart of these peoples, their songs, their myths, their sacred rites, began to slip away. Traditions passed down over centuries were lost with each elder who fell to sickness, each clan that vanished into the dark embrace of extinction. The oral history that had connected generations like an unbroken chain now hung in tatters. Imagine a young survivor, a boy perhaps, listening to his grandmother speak the old stories, only to watch her fall ill before she could pass them all on. The tales of ancestors, of creation, of the sacred ways of the hunt and the spirit world, all vanished as her final breath slipped into the night. Such was the quiet, ceaseless tragedy that unfolded in village after village. And so the survivors became wanderers of memory, carrying fragments of a world no longer whole. But even as their numbers dwindled, a strange and somber resilience took root. Those who remained learned to adapt in ways their ancestors had never imagined. They took in outsiders, orphans of other tribes, escaped slaves, even stray Europeans who chose life among them over the rigid walls of colonial society. In this weaving of broken threads, new forms of identity began to emerge. Tribes that once might have been enemies found common ground in shared survival. Yet this adaptation was both a blessing and a quiet curse. For in merging, in blending, much of the unique essence of each culture began to fade. The distinct songs, dialects, and spiritual practices blurred into echoes of their former selves. And with every passing generation, the question grew sharper in the heart of the native peoples. Were they truly surviving, or merely prolonging an inevitable fading into shadow? The settlers, when they finally arrived in greater numbers, saw only the scattered bands and the quiet, wary faces of those who met them. They could not see the weight of centuries behind those eyes, nor hear the silent songs that had been lost. To the colonizers, this land seemed underused, its people diminished, a land ready for the taking. They did not understand, nor care to know, that they walked upon the ashes of nations. And still, amid this slow-moving nightfall, flickers of defiance remained. In whispered prayers to ancient spirits, in dances held deep within hidden groves, in stories told in secret to the children before sleep, the ember of identity glowed faintly against the dark. The slow extinction of the Native Americans was not a single event nor a simple tragedy. It was a complex, lingering unraveling, a silent, sorrowful erosion shaped as much by unseen sickness as by the quiet collapse of memory and tradition. And as the night stretches on, the question remains, what does it mean to endure when the heart of your world fades away? In the next chapter, we will follow the first ripples of confrontation, where survival would no longer be a quiet act of endurance, but a storm of resistance born from the aching wounds of a disappearing people. The soft hush of dawn crept slowly over the eastern seaboard, bathing the silent forests and shadowed coastlines in pale golden light. The world stirred beneath a sky painted with hues of lavender and soft rose, yet beneath this tranquil morning lay a land forever altered, a land where the ancient heartbeats of native nations now pulsed faint and few. As the early 17th century unfolded, the slow unraveling of the Native American world continued, but a new chapter had begun. A chapter where the silent suffering of disease gave way to the heavy footfalls of foreign settlers. The first quiet years of extinction, marked by plague and the collapse of societies, now gave rise to something far more visible, far more deliberate, the slow, inexorable tide of colonization. It began quietly, as most great tragedies do. Small wooden vessels appeared along the Atlantic coast, bearing men and women whose eyes burned with the fierce light of hunger. Hunger for land, for wealth, for new beginnings. The Pilgrims, the Puritans, the merchants and adventurers all brought with them a vision of a world reshaped in their image. And though they carried with them the invisible agents of death in the form of foreign diseases, they also brought tools more direct, more tangible. Muskets, iron, and the unshakable belief in their own divine right. When the English settlers of Plymouth landed in 1620, they stepped ashore on lands that seemed eerily empty. Villages, fields, and fishing grounds lay quiet beneath the autumn sky. What they did not see, or chose not to see, was the recent shadow that hung over the land. The Wampanoag, once a thriving people, had been gutted by disease. What remained was a fractured society, weakened and wary, its numbers hollowed to a fraction of what they had once been. In this silence, the settlers found their opportunity. They spoke of providence, of a wilderness prepared by the hand of God for their taking. They saw the empty fields not as the graveyards they were, but as a divine blessing. And so, with quiet confidence, they laid claim to land that still echoed with the unmarked graves of those who had died unseen, unknown, and unmourned by the new arrivals. The Wampanoag, under their leader Massasoit, saw things differently. Though weakened, they understood the new reality with a clarity born of survival. They sought alliance with the settlers, hoping perhaps to shield their people from the growing threat of rival tribes, from further incursions of disease, from the silent collapse that seemed to shadow every step of their world. They extended a hand, cautious but open. And for a brief, fragile moment, peace held. But peace, like all things in this unfolding tale, was a fleeting shadow. The settlers' hunger for land grew as surely as their numbers. Each new ship that arrived from across the sea brought more settlers, more claims, more quiet encroachments upon the lands the native peoples still called home. Where once there was mutual trade, there grew suspicion. Where once there was cautious alliance, there bloomed resentment. The land itself bore silent witness to this growing tension. Fields once shared under uneasy agreements were fenced and claimed. Forest paths became roads for wagons. Rivers sacred to the native peoples flowed now with the crafts of settlers and the weight of foreign goods. The old ways began to shrink, not by sudden decree, but by slow creeping change. And amid this quiet conquest, another shadow moved. The diseases, though their first waves had passed, still lingered like embers in a dying fire. Every new contact, every new trade brought fresh sparks of sickness. Measles, influenza, typhus, they flared in outbreaks that struck down even those who had survived the first great plagues. The native communities, already reeling, found themselves locked in a cycle of grief from which there seemed no escape. And yet, within this darkening world, the seeds of resistance began to take root. In the forests of New England, among the tribes of the Algonquian-speaking peoples, the stories of wrongs piled high. Land taken without treaty, sacred sites defiled, promises broken by settlers whose words proved as shifting as the wind. The smouldering resentment gave rise to whispered councils in shadowed groves, to secret gatherings beneath starlit skies. One man would come to embody this growing defiance, a man known to the English as King Philip, but to his people as Metacom. Metacom was the son of Massasoit, the same chief who had once extended a cautious hand of friendship to the Plymouth settlers. He had watched, year by slow year, as the English consumed more land, imposed their laws, and sought to subjugate the native peoples beneath their will. By the 1670s, the time for patience had withered away. What followed would come to be known as King Philip's War, a brutal, desperate conflict that tore through the heart of New England. But before the first musket fired, before the first village burned, there was the silent, aching realization among the native peoples that they stood upon a precipice. They faced not merely loss of land, but extinction of their ways, their stories, their very identity. This war, when it came, would not be fought merely for territory. It would be fought for survival against an enemy armed not only with weapons, but with the silent, creeping power of disease and the cold certainty of a world that saw the native peoples as obstacles to be removed. In the quiet before the storm, Metacom walked among his people, a leader torn between his father's legacy of fragile peace and the rising call of resistance that echoed through every broken promise, every stolen acre. And so, under the soft hush of gathering clouds, the ember of defiance began to glow in the darkened heart of a fading world. This chapter closes not with battle, nor with conquest, but with a lingering sense of inevitable sorrow. A sorrow born of a people who knew that the tides of their world were shifting beyond their power to stop, yet who still dared to stand even against the rising storm. In the next chapter, we will step into the heart of that storm, a storm that would rage not only upon the battlefield, but within the fragile hearts of a people fighting not merely for land, but for the last fragile echoes of a world that time, sickness, and greed conspired to erase. The morning mist clung softly to the quiet woods of New England, curling around tree trunks and winding gently through the undergrowth like a veil of whispered memory. Beneath that silent canopy, the world seemed hushed, as if holding its breath for the storm that was about to break. By the summer of 1675, the land that stretched from the rolling hills of Massachusetts to the dark forests of Rhode Island stood on the edge of a desperate conflict. The tensions between the Native American tribes and the English settlers had grown sharp, brittle as dry twigs beneath a hunter's step. The peace that had once flickered, tenuous and trembling, now hung by a single fraying thread. At the heart of this coming storm stood Metacom, the Wampanoag leader the English would come to call King Philip. His face, often described in settler accounts as stern and watchful, hid a heart weighed down by the burdens of a vanishing world. He was no stranger to the shifting tides. He had seen his people stripped of land, bound by foreign laws, forced into humiliating treaties where each word bent the will of the native peoples toward the colonists' design. His father, Massasoit, had brokered peace with the newcomers in hopes of survival. But now, with the fields of his ancestors shrinking beneath the greedy hands of English settlers, Metacom saw the futility of endless patience. The time for silent endurance had ended. The spark that lit the fire of war came not from a grand battle nor a bold declaration, but from a single, quiet death, a native man named John Sassamon. A Christian convert and a man of two worlds, Sassamon had warned the settlers of Metacom's gathering plans. Shortly after, his body was found beneath the ice of Assawampset Pond. The settlers blamed Metacom's men. Metacom, in turn, saw in the settlers swift, uncompromising justice, yet another thread in the web of injustice tightening around his people. And so the embers of war ignited. In June of 1675, the first shots were fired in a small village known as Swansea. The native warriors moved with the swiftness of shadows, striking at isolated homesteads, burning settlements, and vanishing into the forest before the settlers could mount a defense. Their attacks were not mere raids. They were the cry of a people pushed to the edge of oblivion. The settlers, shocked by the sudden ferocity, struck back with a vengeance born of fear and fury. Militias gathered, towns fortified, alliances forged in the fires of shared dread. Yet the native warriors, familiar with the forests and the hidden paths, danced around the heavy boots of colonial soldiers. As summer deepened into autumn, the war spread like a dark stain across New England. Tribes that had once lived in wary peace with the settlers now joined Metacom's cause. The Narragansett, the Nipmuc, and even factions of the Pocumtuck and the Abenaki. The settlers, in turn, called upon their own alliances, drawing in native groups who saw in Metacom's rebellion a threat to their own fragile existence. The war was brutal beyond measure. Villages were set ablaze beneath darkened skies. Families fled into the forests only to be hunted down like animals. Entire communities vanished in a single night's bloodshed. Yet even amid the horror, there lay a haunting sense of inevitability. Metacom and his warriors fought with a desperate courage, a burning resolve shaped by the knowledge that they battled not merely for land, but for the very survival of their people's spirit. For every victory they won, the colonists answered with overwhelming force. For every village they defended, 3 more fell under the colonial sword. Disease, always the silent hand behind the scenes, crept alongside the war. Weakened by sickness and hunger, many native warriors fought on despite festering wounds and fevered blood. The war, brutal and unrelenting, drained the strength of the native peoples faster than their enemies' weapons. By the winter of 1675, the tide began to turn. The colonial militias, bolstered by superior numbers and supplies, struck at the heart of native strongholds. One such assault, the Great Swamp Fight, fell upon the Narragansett people. In the depths of a bitter winter, colonial forces attacked a fortified village hidden within the frozen swamplands. The battle was savage, the outcome devastating. Hundreds of native men, women and children perished in fire and ice. It was a wound from which the native resistance would never fully recover. Metacom, hunted, his alliances crumbling, fled deeper into the forests of southern New England. But even as his world fell into ruin, he did not surrender. He moved from village to village, a shadow of defiance, a ghost among the trees. His was a war not of conquest, but of last stands. A war waged against the relentless advance of a new world that sought to erase the old. In August of 1676, Metacom met his end. Tracked by colonial soldiers and native allies loyal to the English, he was cornered and killed near Mount Hope. His body, in a grim display of colonial triumph, was quartered and his head placed upon a pike, a silent warning to any who might dream of resistance. With his death, King Philip's War shuddered to its bitter conclusion. But the war's end was not a victory. Not truly. For both native and settler alike, it left a scar that would never fade. The native peoples of New England lay shattered, whole tribes extinguished, their numbers decimated, their lands seized without pretense of treaty or agreement. The settlers, too, bore the marks of a war fought in fear and desperation. They had seen their towns burned, their families slain. Yet, unlike the native peoples, they held the power to rebuild, to expand, to take what they had always hungered for. And so, in the aftermath, the silent extinction of the Native Americans marched on, not with roaring battles, but with quiet, relentless conquest. King Philip's War was but a single chapter, a flash of open defiance amid a long, slow drowning. The deeper mystery remained. Why did the native peoples, so vast in number and deep in wisdom, stand so vulnerable before a tide they had neither summoned nor fully understood? In the next part of this silent story, we will drift further west, to the untouched frontiers where new peoples lived beneath the wide sky, still unaware that the silent storm that had consumed the east would soon reach them, carrying the same dark fate wrapped in the soft whispers of wind and shadow. Beyond the rolling hills of New England, past the familiar woods and worn trails of the eastern seaboard, stretched a land vast and untamed. A world of towering mountains, endless plains and winding rivers that gleamed beneath the open sky. Here in the heart of the continent, the heartbeat of ancient nations throbbed steadily, untouched for a time by the shadow that had already fallen upon the eastern tribes. It was in these great interior lands that cultures such as the Lakota, the Mandan, the Hidatsa and the Arikara thrived. They lived upon the wide prairies and along the rich riverbanks, their lives woven tightly with the rhythms of nature. The Great Plains, with its seas of swaying grasses and thundering bison herds, offered them both sustenance and a deep spiritual connection. For generations, these tribes flourished in a world seemingly beyond the reach of European ambition. Their societies were complex, woven through kinship networks, trade routes that spanned thousands of miles, and ceremonial traditions that bound them to the land and to each other. Yet even in this distant heartland, the silent storm stirred. By the mid-17th century, whispers began to drift across the ancient trails. whispers of a sickness carried on the wind, of peoples to the east who had vanished beneath waves of invisible death. The tales came from traders and travellers, passed in hushed voices beside campfires. They spoke of entire villages succumbing overnight, of warriors struck down by unseen hands, of children laid to rest in numbers too great to count. At first, these stories seemed like distant shadows, tales of misfortune that belonged to another world. But shadows, once noticed, have a way of creeping closer. The first known blow came quietly, almost unnoticed amid the ebb and flow of tribal life. In the year 1738, smallpox, this silent assassin of nations, struck the Mandan people of the upper Missouri River. The Mandan, renowned for their earth lodge villages and thriving trade, stood at the heart of a vast network that connected the northern plains with tribes from the forests, the mountains, and the distant south. Their villages, vibrant hubs of exchange and culture, had long been centers of life on the plains. When the disease came, it fell upon them like a silent winter. The smallpox arrived, as it so often did, through trade, woven invisibly into the furs and goods exchanged between hands. Within days of the first reported cases, the sickness spread like fire through the tightly knit communities. The symptoms were as cruel as they were swift: burning fever, relentless vomiting, and the telltale pustules that marred once healthy skin with agonizing sores. There were no healers among the Mandan, nor among any of the plains tribes, who knew how to combat this unseen enemy. Their medicines, powerful against wounds of war and sicknesses of their own lands, faltered against this foreign plague. The infection moved swiftly, without mercy. Villages that had once echoed with laughter and song fell into eerie silence. The dead lay in their lodges, unburied, as the living grew too weak or too frightened to perform the sacred rites of passing. The Mandan, once proud stewards of trade and culture, saw their numbers collapse in a single brutal season. The survivors, hollowed by grief and fear, carried with them a new burden, a whispered knowledge that no land was truly beyond the reach of the storm. In the years that followed, the disease did not vanish. It moved along the ancient trade routes like a shadow with no end. The Arikara suffered in their turn, their villages hollowed by the same invisible hand. The Hidatsa, the Omaha, the Pawnee all felt the touch of this foreign curse. And yet, amid the devastation, the question lingered: why were these peoples so deeply rooted in the land and hardened by its trials, so powerless against this enemy? The answer lay hidden in the unseen world of biology, a mystery of immune systems shaped by thousands of years of separation. In Europe, the Old World, generations had suffered beneath the weight of countless plagues: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. These diseases ravaged populations repeatedly, each wave sparing only those with some measure of resistance coded into their blood. But the peoples of the Americas had been separated from the Old World for over 15,000 years. In all that time, they had not shared in those deadly plagues. Their bodies, their immune defenses, had never learned the cruel lessons of survival against such foes. When smallpox arrived, it did so as a perfect predator in a land of unguarded prey. And so, the disease moved from village to village, invisible and relentless. The impact was not merely physical. The death of so many strained every thread of native society. Elders, the keepers of stories and traditions, fell before they could pass on their knowledge. Hunters and warriors died before they could teach the next generation. Women, the heart of the village, the weavers of life and culture, perished in numbers too great to be replaced. The sacred ceremonies, those fragile rituals that bound the people to the land and to each other, began to fade from memory. Songs were forgotten, stories passed into silence. The survivors bore not only the scars of loss, but the weight of a crushing isolation. For the native peoples of the plains, the sickness became a shadow that lingered in every gathering, every alliance, every hunt. It bred fear not only of the outsiders who brought it, but of their own neighbors, of strangers on familiar trails, of every whispered rumor of sickness on the wind. And yet, even as the disease sought to unmake them, a quiet strength endured. The Mandan, though devastated, did not vanish. They rebuilt their lodges, tended their crops, resumed their trade. The Arikara mourned their dead and continued their lives along the rivers. The Sioux, sensing the shifting balance of power on the plains, began to rise as a force not easily ignored, adapting swiftly to the changes wrought by the sickness and the shifting alliances of the region. This was the silent resilience of a people who understood, even amid death, the deep-rooted need to endure. But as the 18th century waned, the storms that had ravaged the East now began to sweep westward with new force. Disease had been only the first harbinger. Behind it marched settlers, soldiers, and the relentless machinery of an empire whose hunger for land and dominion knew no limits. In the next part of this unfolding story, we will follow the tide as it presses ever westward, toward the Rocky Mountains, the Great Plains, and the deserts beyond, where the native peoples, still reeling from the silent wars of disease, would face the sharp edge of conquest and the bitter weight of a new extinction yet to come. The wind swept gently across the vast prairies, whispering through the tall grasses that swayed like golden seas beneath the endless sky. Here in the heart of the Great Plains, a delicate balance endured, a fragile tapestry of life woven by countless generations of native peoples whose hearts beat in rhythm with the land. Yet, as the 18th century gave way to the 19th, a darker wind began to rise. It carried with it not only the scent of foreign settlements and distant wars, but the slow, relentless weight of a new kind of extinction. For centuries, the peoples of the Great Plains, Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, had lived in dynamic harmony with their world. They followed the great bison herds, moving with the seasons, their societies shaped by the open land and the fierce independence that the plains demanded. They were warriors, traders, hunters, and poets of the wide horizon. Their lives were tied to the land, not by fences or ownership, but by an ancient understanding of coexistence. But change, like a creeping shadow, had already begun its silent advance. Long before the iron rails of the railroad sliced through the heartland, the first waves of European expansion reached the fringes of the plains. French traders from the north, Spanish expeditions from the south, and later American fur traders all brought with them the quiet, deadly echoes of diseases that had decimated the eastern tribes. Each encounter, each exchange of goods carried unseen dangers nestled within. Smallpox struck the plains again in 1780, a plague as sudden and ruthless as the prairie storms that rolled across the sky. Entire bands of native peoples fell within days, their camps reduced to hushed circles of the dead. The Comanche, once a dominant power of the southern plains, lost untold numbers to the disease, their warriors falling alongside their women and children. The Kiowa, too, saw their numbers hollowed by the relentless advance of illness. And yet, even as sickness burned its way through their lands, the plains peoples adapted. They did not fade quietly into shadow. Instead, they reshaped their lives around the new realities forced upon them. The horse, introduced by the Spanish and swiftly mastered by tribes like the Comanche and Lakota, transformed the plains into a domain of mounted warriors and swift-moving communities. The bison hunt became the heart of a mobile way of life, binding tribes together in complex alliances and fierce rivalries. But survival amid the silent enemy of disease came at a price paid in traditions lost, elders buried before their wisdom could pass on, and sacred ceremonies abandoned for lack of those who remembered the ancient rites. The spread of disease weakened more than bodies. It strained the intricate web of alliances that had held the plains peoples together. Fear of contagion bred suspicion. Communities once bound by trade and kinship grew wary of strangers, each wary of the invisible threat that traveled unseen between them. This quiet erosion of trust gnawed at the heart of tribal unity, making resistance to the coming storm all the more fragile. And the storm was coming. In the early 1800s, a new force began to move inexorably across the American landscape, the surge of American expansionism, driven by the belief in manifest destiny. It was an idea forged in the halls of power and whispered in the dreams of settlers, that the land of the continent was destined to belong to the newcomers, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. With this ideology came not only settlers and soldiers, but a systematic effort to claim the heart of the continent, regardless of the lives already woven into its soil. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 brought millions of acres of native land under American control, on paper, if not yet in fact. The Lewis and Clark expedition, often remembered as a bold journey of discovery, was in truth a harbinger of a darker fate. As they charted the rivers and mapped the trails, Lewis and Clark met with dozens of native nations, some welcoming, some wary. Their journals spoke often of the friendly savages, a term soaked in condescension, blind to the silent suffering already carried within these communities. But what the explorers recorded with less awareness was the undercurrent of fear that flowed beneath every encounter. Many of the tribes they met had already been touched by disease, some reduced to mere shadows of their former strength. The Blackfeet, the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, all bore the quiet scars of sickness that had arrived long before American flags ever fluttered in their lands. The explorers moved on, their mission complete, but they left behind more than maps. They opened paths for traders, trappers, and later settlers, whose steady advance would become a rising tide the native peoples could not hold back. And as these paths deepened into roads, the diseases followed once more. The 1837 smallpox epidemic proved one of the deadliest blows to the Plains peoples. Carried aboard a steamboat, the St. Peter's, traveling up the Missouri River, the disease spread with horrifying speed. The Mandan, once reduced but still enduring, saw their people fall in staggering numbers. Over 90% of their population wiped away in a single summer. The disease leapt from village to village, carried by trade, contact, and the bitter winds of misfortune. For the native nations of the Missouri, the smallpox epidemic of 1837 was more than a tragedy. It was a silent apocalypse. Yet even amid such devastation, the embers of survival glowed faintly. The Lakota, who would rise to become a formidable force on the northern plains, used their mobility and unity to navigate the shifting tides. They formed powerful alliances, absorbed remnants of other tribes, and moved deeper into the heart of the plains, seeking refuge in the vast openness that had long been their sanctuary. The Comanche, the masters of the southern plains, forged an empire of mounted warriors, dominating the lands from the Arkansas River to northern Mexico. But time, disease, and destiny pressed ever onward. The American frontier moved westward with a slow, relentless force, powered by treaties broken as easily as they were signed, by soldiers marching beneath flags, and by settlers who saw only empty land where entire nations had once lived and thrived. Each new settlement brought fresh waves of disease, fresh fractures in the fragile fabric of native resistance. And behind it all, the silent mystery deepened. Why had no immunity taken root? Why did the native peoples, after centuries of suffering under these foreign plagues, remain so vulnerable? The answer lay in cruel biological truth. Because with each wave of disease, the communities most affected were those most closely connected, most populous, most central to trade and culture. The survivors often moved apart, smaller in number, more isolated, less able to build the communal strength needed to withstand the next wave. The silent extinction was not a single blow, nor a swift conquest. It was a slow, creeping fog that dulled the vibrancy of entire peoples until only faint echoes remained. In the next chapter of this unfolding story, we will follow the trail toward the Western Mountains and beyond, where the last untouched frontiers awaited the final march of a silent destiny that had already claimed so many lives, so many voices lost to the soft, indifferent march of time and shadow. The sun rose softly over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, casting a pale golden light upon ridges still veiled in the last whispers of dawn mist. These towering guardians had long stood as silent witnesses to the ancient rhythms of the land, a barrier and a refuge, a world apart from the eastern forests and the rolling plains. Beneath their vast shadows, the native peoples of the Western Territories carved their lives with quiet resilience, their stories winding like hidden trails through canyons and highland meadows. For centuries, the tribes of the Rocky Mountains and their surrounding basins, Shoshone, Ute, Blackfeet, Crow, Nez Perce, had lived in a world largely untouched by the hand of European conquest. The mountains stood as a natural wall, sheltering their lives from the direct incursions of settlers and soldiers. They fished the crystal lakes, hunted the herds that roamed the alpine slopes, and passed their stories in soft voices beneath the ancient trees. But even the mountains could not hold back the silent tide that had swept across the continent. By the early 1800s, the first waves of disease, riding on the backs of traders, trappers, and wandering explorers, began to seep into these high places. The Shoshone, known for their deep knowledge of the mountain trails and their peaceful trade with neighboring tribes, were among the first to feel the shadow. Smallpox and measles crept into their camps, carried unknowingly by distant contacts returning from the plains or the settlements of the Far East. It happened quietly, as it always did. One season, a few fell ill after a trading expedition. The next, entire families vanished beneath the weight of fever and rash. The healers of the Shoshone, skilled in the ancient ways of tending wounds and sickness, stood helpless before this foreign plague. Their medicines, drawn from the herbs and spirits of their land, could do nothing to halt a sickness born of distant shores. The Ute, fierce and proud, roaming the high deserts and mountain valleys, fared no better. Their warriors, renowned for their skill on horseback, found themselves powerless against an enemy that did not fight with blade or arrow, but moved unseen within the breath and touch of friends and family. The patterns repeated, echoing the silent tragedies that had unfolded across the east and the plains. The Blackfeet, once a dominant power of the northern Rockies, suffered repeated blows from smallpox epidemics. In 1837, as the plague travelled yet again along the Missouri River, it found its way into Blackfeet territory. The loss was staggering, thousands dead in a matter of weeks. Villages once bustling with life were reduced to hollow shadows of grief. The Blackfeet, known for their fierce defense of their lands, found themselves crippled, not by war but by the quiet cruelty of unseen death. And yet, even amid the heartache, life endured in fragile, flickering ways. The Crow, long enemies of the Blackfeet, absorbed refugees and orphans from neighboring tribes, binding them into new families, new clans. The Nez Perce, famed for their horsemanship and deep spiritual traditions, retreated deeper into the mountain valleys, carrying with them the embers of their culture and the hope that distance might shield them from the silent killer. But distance was no true defense. With each passing year, the pathways into the mountains grew wider. Fur traders, French, British, American, moved steadily into the highlands, their packs laden with goods, their hands unknowingly carrying the seeds of death. The mountain men of the early 19th century, so often romanticized in later tales, were silent harbingers of tragedy. They traded with the tribes, shared their camps, broke bread by the fires, and with every touch, every breath, the sickness traveled on. The fragile isolation of the Rocky Mountain tribes unraveled, thread by quiet thread. And then, as always, came the settlers. The great migration westward, the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, the endless wagon trains, cut through the heart of native lands like slow-moving rivers of change. Families seeking a new life, driven by the dream of open land and fertile soil, crossed through territories long held sacred by the native peoples. They brought with them cattle, wagons, and diseases that moved faster than their slow, creaking wheels. The native peoples watched, wary, from the shadows of the mountains and the banks of winding rivers, as this foreign tide pressed forward without pause or care. And within this silent invasion, the quiet mystery of extinction deepened. Why did no resistance, no adaptation take hold? Why, even after decades of contact, did the native peoples remain so vulnerable to the plagues that accompanied the settlers? The cruel answer lay hidden in the simple mathematics of survival. In small, isolated populations, the loss of even a few members carried devastating weight. Unlike the dense populations of Europe, where immunity could slowly build over generations, the native communities could not sustain such losses. Each wave of disease cut too deeply, erased too much, leaving behind a community weakened not only in number but in memory, in tradition, in the very heart of its identity. The guardians of culture, the elders, the shamans, the keepers of stories were often the first to fall. With them went the songs, the sacred rites, the ancestral wisdom carried across centuries. The youth, left adrift, inherited a world frayed at the edges, where the old ways became whispers and the future stretched uncertain before them. In the mountains, as on the plains and in the forests before them, the native peoples fought not only against death, but against the slow erosion of their spirit. Yet amid this creeping sorrow, glimmers of resilience shone faintly. The Nez Perce, guided by leaders like Chief Joseph, would later stand defiantly against the pressures of conquest, carrying with them a fierce pride rooted in the highland valleys of their ancestors. The Shoshone, led by figures such as Sacagawea, found ways to navigate the shifting world, sometimes as guides, sometimes as quiet resistors, always as survivors. But even the bravest hearts could not hold back the tide alone. The diseases moved on as relentless as the rising sun. The settlers came in greater numbers, followed by soldiers, forts, and railroads. And behind them, always, came the silent companions of death, smallpox, measles, influenza, riding the same winds that had carried them across forests, plains, and now mountains. The Rocky Mountains, once a refuge of quiet endurance, became another chapter in the silent story of disappearance. In the next part of this journey, we will turn our eyes toward the westernmost frontiers, the great deserts, the arid basins, the coastal lands, where the last untouched nations would face not only the silent killers of disease, but the direct, crushing force of an empire's hunger, marching beneath the banners of manifest destiny and the soft, indifferent whispers of a world changing forever. The summer sky hung low over the vast plains, casting a golden veil across a land that seemed both eternal and fragile. From the jagged mountain ridges to the soft whisper of prairie grass, a silent hush blanketed the wilderness. It was in this quietude that a caravan of French trappers moved eastward, their canoes slicing through the mirrored surface of a winding river. The year was 1673, and they carried with them not just furs and hopes of fortune, but whispers. Dark, unsettling whispers that echoed through trading posts and native villages alike. Jacques Lemire, the caravan's leader, was a man seasoned by the harshness of frontier life. His hands bore the scars of countless winters, and his eyes, a pale, steely grey, seemed ever watchful beneath the brim of his wide leather hat. But this journey, unlike any before, filled him with a quiet dread. For weeks now, they had travelled along the waterways, stopping at settlements where once thriving tribes now stood in eerie silence or lay in ruin. Villages emptied, wigwams abandoned, fires long since cold. It began subtly, with rumours carried on the wind, whispers of a sickness, of entire clans vanishing as though spirited away by some unseen force. The Menominee had spoken of it in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the woods as if fearing to name it aloud. They called it the Great Shadow, a creeping curse that stole breath and life alike. Jacques, a man of the world, had dismissed it at first as native superstition. But the evidence, the silent forests, the abandoned lodges, the trails untravelled, had become too tangible to ignore. Their journey took them deeper into the heartland, where the Illinois Confederation once thrived along the riverbanks. But the villages here lay lifeless too, their fields overgrown, their longhouses empty. The only sounds were the cawing of distant crows and the soft rustle of wind in the trees. The men grew restless. At night, huddled by their campfires, they spoke in low voices of the strange quiet that seemed to swallow even the echoes of their own words. It was on such a night, under a vault of shimmering stars, that Jacques encountered a figure who would haunt his memory forever. They had made camp along a bend in the river, the forest pressing close on either side. Jacques, restless with unease, wandered from the firelight, seeking solace in the cool hush of the woods. It was there, beneath a stand of birches, that he saw her. A young native woman, standing motionless in the half-light, her dark eyes fixed upon him. She was slight, draped in a faded buckskin dress, her hair falling in two long braids over her shoulders. There was an otherworldly stillness about her, a calm that was almost unnatural. Jacques felt his heart quicken, not from fear but from a strange, inexplicable sorrow. For in her eyes he saw a reflection of the desolation that now hung over the land. They regarded each other in silence for a long moment before she spoke, her voice a soft whisper carried on the night air. "You should not be here." Jacques felt his throat tighten. "Why?" he managed, his voice barely a breath. "The shadow is near," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "It takes those who linger." He stepped forward, compelled by a need he could not name. "What is it? A sickness? A spirit?" She shook her head, her braids swaying softly. "It is many things. It is the breath of strangers who do not know this land. It is the greed that hungers for what was never theirs. It is the sorrow of a people who watch their world fade." Jacques felt a chill creep along his spine. He opened his mouth to speak, but the woman stepped back, her form seeming to dissolve into the shadows of the trees. Only her voice lingered, a fading whisper in the darkness. Leave, before the shadow takes you too. When he returned to camp, the fire burned low, and the men slept in uneasy slumber. Jacques sat alone by the embers, the weight of the encounter pressing upon him like a heavy cloak. He said nothing of the woman to his companions, but from that night his dreams were filled with haunting visions, of empty villages, of silent forests, and of a shadow that moved unseen across the land, devouring all in its path. Days turned into weeks, and the caravan pressed on, though their steps grew slower, their hearts heavier. They passed through lands once teeming with life, now eerily silent. They encountered bones bleached by the sun, canoes adrift and empty, lodges caved in upon themselves as if abandoned in haste. One morning, they stumbled upon a solitary figure, a native elder seated beside a dying fire at the edge of a crumbling village. His face was lined with the deep etchings of time, his eyes distant and hollow. Jacques approached with a reverence born of unease. The old man looked up, and for a moment their eyes met, a silent exchange of sorrow and understanding. "They are gone," the elder murmured, his voice a mere breath. "The wind carried them away." Jacques knelt beside him. "What happened?" The elder gazed into the smouldering embers. "You brought it," he said softly. "Not you alone, but your kind. With your goods, with your greed, with your sickness. It swept through our people like a fire in dry grass." Jacques felt a knot tighten in his chest. "I didn't know." The old man nodded, a ghost of a smile tracing his weathered lips. "No one does, not until it is too late." That night, as Jacques sat watch beneath the endless sky, he felt the weight of generations pressing upon him, the sorrow of a world slipping silently into shadow. He realized then that the mystery was no mystery at all. It was a slow, creeping inevitability, an unraveling wrought not by some malevolent spirit, but by the quiet march of conquest, disease, and sorrow. And in that moment, Jacques Lemire, a man of trade and fortune, felt the faint stirrings of a different legacy. One not written in ledgers or treaties, but in the whispered warnings of a fading people and the haunting silence of a vanishing world. The summer waned into autumn, and with it came a deepening chill that clung not just to the air, but to the hearts of the men who travelled with Jacques Lemire. They moved now as shadows themselves, speaking little, their footsteps softened by the sodden earth beneath thinning trees. The leaves burned briefly in hues of amber and crimson before falling, blanketing the forest floor like forgotten embers of a dying fire. And still, they pressed onward into lands where even the wind seemed reluctant to stir. Their route took them southward along the great river, its banks winding like a silver serpent through lands untouched by European hands. Yet the haunting emptiness clung to the landscape. Where they had once expected to find bustling encampments of the Cahokia and Kaskaskia peoples, they found only derelict lodges and the remnants of campfires, long since cold. The villages were vacant, yet signs of hurried departure remained, half-cooked meals left to rot, tools abandoned, canoes moored but never taken. Jacques found himself watching the horizon with growing apprehension. The world felt hollowed, as though stripped of its pulse. Even the animals moved differently, silent, wary, their eyes holding a strange, knowing fear. It was as though the entire land had inhaled and held its breath, waiting for something unseen to pass. One evening, as the sun bled crimson over the western sky, Jacques' party reached a bend in the river where a single lodge stood amid a ring of tall grasses. Smoke trailed thinly from its chimney, a rare sign of life. The men exchanged glances, each feeling the weight of suspicion and curiosity gnawing at their resolve. At Jacques' nod, they approached with careful steps, their hands close to the hilts of their hunting knives. An old woman emerged from the lodge's entrance as they neared. She was slight and stooped, her hair a curtain of silver that fell in tangled strands to her waist. Her face was lined not only with age, but with the quiet resignation of one who had seen too much sorrow. Her dark eyes met Jacques's without fear or welcome, only a deep, enduring wariness. "You come for trade," she said softly, her voice like the hush of wind through reeds. Jacques inclined his head. "We come seeking, understanding." The old woman gave a slow nod and motioned them inside. The lodge was simple, its walls lined with woven mats and the scent of dried herbs heavy in the air. A small fire crackled at the center, casting flickering shadows that danced along the walls like silent spectres. They sat in a ring around the fire, and for a long while no words passed between them. The old woman stirred a pot suspended over the flames, her hands moving with the measured grace of ritual. Jacques watched her, feeling an inexplicable reverence settle over him. At last she spoke. "You carry it with you." Jacques met her gaze. "The sickness?" She gave a slow, mournful shake of her head. "Not just the sickness, the hunger, the need to take. It is an old shadow, older than your people know. You bring more than trade. You bring the end of things." A silence fell over the gathering, thick as the smoke curling toward the lodge's ceiling. One of Jack's men shifted uneasily, glancing at the door as though the shadow she spoke of might slip through at any moment. Jack found his voice. "I don't wish for that. I came only to understand, to see why so many have vanished." The old woman's eyes softened, though sadness still rested heavy within them. "You cannot see what is already gone," she whispered. "We have faded, not because we are weak, but because your world does not know how to share. Your people bring gifts with one hand and take with the other. Disease, war, the weight of 1,000 small sorrows, these are your shadows. They steal the breath from our children, the hope from our elders, and now there is little left to take." Jacques felt a hollow ache in his chest, a gnawing guilt that words could not ease. "Is there nothing to stop it?" he asked quietly. The old woman stirred the pot again, her hands steady. "The land will remember, long after you and I are gone. The rivers, the mountains, they will remember our songs, our sorrow. But for us, there is only the fading." A soft wind whispered through the cracks in the lodge's walls, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and dying leaves. Jacques bowed his head, overcome by a sadness deeper than any he had ever known. The silence that followed was not empty, but filled with the quiet mourning of a world slipping quietly into shadow. When they left the next morning, the old woman stood by the lodge's doorway, watching them with eyes that held neither blame nor forgiveness. Jacques met her gaze one last time, lifting his hand in a gesture of farewell. She did not return it. She only stood, silent and still, as the men faded into the misted landscape. The caravan moved on, the world around them growing colder with each passing day. The trees stood bare, skeletal against the pale sky. The wind sang a mournful dirge through the branches, a song of things lost and things yet to be forgotten. Jacques Lemire walked at the head of the party, his heart heavy with the weight of truths he could neither change nor escape. The shadow moved with them now, not a spectre lurking in the trees, but a quiet presence etched into the land itself. It followed in their footsteps, a silent reminder of the lives displaced, the hearts broken and the histories unwritten. And still the road stretched on, winding deeper into a world forever changed by forces no one man could comprehend. The winds of October swept down from the north, carrying with them a rawness that bit at exposed skin and whispered through the brittle branches of the trees. The land had grown barren, its colours dulled, its life withdrawn, as though nature itself recoiled from an unseen affliction. Jacques Lemire and his men pressed onward along the narrow river paths, the steady rhythm of paddles slicing water giving their minds something, anything, to cling to amid the oppressive quiet. By now they had grown used to the silence of the villages they passed. What had once filled them with dread now settled into a grim acceptance. The signs were always the same. Abandoned longhouses leaning into decay, cooking pits cold and scattered with half-burnt wood, the faint imprint of footsteps that led nowhere. It was as though an entire people had risen from their daily lives and vanished into the very air, leaving no trace but a hollow echo in the land's memory. On the 7th morning of their southward journey, they came upon a river crossing marked by a wooden effigy, a figure carved crudely from driftwood and bound with strips of leather, its face daubed with ochre and charcoal. It stood at the riverbank, arms outstretched toward the water, its expression a frozen mask of sorrow. The men hesitated, their eyes drawn to the figure with a mixture of unease and dark curiosity. Jacques disembarked and approached the effigy alone. The air around it felt colder somehow, though the wind was no stronger here than along the rest of the river. He circled it slowly, noting the weathered symbols etched into its wooden surface, spirals, eyes, open hands. None of it familiar, yet all of it spoke to something ancient and unresolved. A voice, low and steady, broke the hush behind him. They placed these to mark the last crossing. Jacques turned. It was Mathieu, one of the younger men in his party, a wiry trapper from Rouen whose bravado had withered over the course of the journey. His face was pale beneath his hood, his eyes fixed upon the effigy with something like dread. "The last crossing?" Jacques echoed. Mathieu nodded, his voice tightening. "I heard tales back at Fort Frontenac. They say when a village knows the sickness is near, the people leave a marker at the river's edge, a warning for those who follow." Jacques felt a chill settle deep within him. He looked back at the figure, its silent vigil unmoving, unwavering. A warning, or a farewell? Mathieu gave no answer. They passed by in silence, giving the effigy a wide berth as they paddled onward, their canoes gliding softly through waters that seemed darker with each passing mile. The river narrowed into a winding channel, its banks choked with reeds and blackened stumps of long dead trees. Even the birds had grown scarce, save for a lone heron that watched them from a shadowed bend, its eyes glinting like twin shards of obsidian. That night, they made camp in a hollow by the water's edge, where willows hung low and silent over the bank. The men gathered close around the fire, its meagre warmth fighting a losing battle against the creeping cold. No one spoke of the effigy, though its memory lingered in the uneasy glances they cast toward the darkened woods. Jacques sat apart, staring into the flames, his thoughts circling endlessly. The old woman's words echoed in his mind, the hunger, the sorrow, the shadow. He felt it now, not as a distant threat but as a quiet presence entwined with the land itself. A slow erosion of life, as inevitable and silent as the falling of autumn leaves. Somewhere beyond the flicker of firelight, a soft rustle stirred the stillness. Jacques rose, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his hunting knife. He stepped toward the sound, his boots crunching softly on the frost-tipped grass. The forest lay before him in shifting shades of grey, the moon casting silver veins through the canopy. For a moment he saw nothing, only shadows and the faint ripple of wind through the branches. Then, at the edge of the trees, a figure emerged. It was a man, or had once been. Tall, gaunt, his skin stretched tight over sharp bones, his eyes hollow and sunken. He wore no adornment save for a cloak of thin, tattered hide, and his hands hung limply at his sides, fingers clawed like the roots of a dead tree. His gaze met Jacques', and in that gaze Jacques saw a depth of suffering he could scarcely comprehend. They stared at each other, two men on opposite sides of a silent abyss. The figure did not move, did not speak. Yet Jacques felt a weight press upon his chest, a sorrow so vast it seemed to draw the breath from his lungs. He could not tell whether the man was alive or some spectre drawn from the land's despair. Before Jacques could speak or even think to, the figure turned, stepping silently into the woods, vanishing among the trees as though swallowed by the very earth. Jacques stood motionless for a long moment, the cold seeping into his bones. Then, without a word, he returned to the fire. His men looked up at his approach, questions hanging unsaid in the air. But Jacques shook his head slowly and sat down once more by the flames. The night deepened around them, thick with the silence of things left unspoken. And so they slept, uneasy beneath a sky heavy with stars, each man alone with his thoughts, with his fears, and with the silent truth that they, too, were part of a shadow that stretched far beyond their understanding. By the dawn of the 13th morning since they had first entered the heart of the vanished lands, the light itself seemed thinner, as though the sun, too, had begun to withdraw from a world that had grown weary of its gaze. The sky stretched pale and vast overhead, washed in muted hues of grey and silver, offering no warmth to those who walked beneath it. Jacques Lemire stood upon the riverbank, watching as wisps of mist drifted across the water's surface like silent, disembodied spectres. The night's vision, or encounter, if indeed it had been real, gnawed quietly at his mind. The hollow man with the dead eyes, the silent step into the forest, the weight of an ancient sorrow made flesh. Jacques had said nothing of it to his companions, for what words could contain such a vision? And yet an unspoken heaviness settled over the group that morning as they packed their gear and resumed their journey, as though each man felt some subtle thread of dread tugging at the edges of his heart. The river guided them southward, winding between dense forests and low hills, where the trees seemed older, twisted into strange forms by centuries of wind and storm. They moved in silence, their paddles cutting smooth arcs in the still water, the only sound the soft murmur of the current and the occasional creak of wood and leather. The world around them seemed suspended between life and death, a place where time moved differently, slower, more uncertain. As the afternoon waned, they came upon a village unlike the others they had seen. This one had not been abandoned in haste. The lodges stood intact, the fires still smouldering faintly in the central hearth. Tools lay neatly arranged beside woven mats, baskets of dried maize stacked with careful precision. It was a scene of quiet order, untouched by panic or flight. Yet there was no one. Jacques and his men disembarked, their boots pressing softly into the earth as they stepped into the silent heart of the village. The air was still, thick with the faint scent of cedar smoke and dried herbs. It was as though the inhabitants had simply vanished between one heartbeat and the next, leaving their lives behind like a whisper of their existence. Jacques entered the largest lodge at the center of the village. Its doorway hung with a curtain of beaded leather. The interior was warm with the last embers of a dying fire. A woven cradle sat beside the hearth, its delicate frame swaying gently in the faint draught. Jacques approached it slowly, a quiet dread coiling in his chest. The cradle was empty. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the room, blankets folded neatly, pottery stacked with care, a carved flute resting atop a cedar shelf. Everything was in its place, untouched by violence or haste. And yet there was a feeling, a palpable absence that pressed against his senses like a silent scream lingering in the air. Outside, the men moved quietly among the lodges, their faces drawn tight with unease. Matthew crouched beside a row of baskets, lifting one gently in his hands. "This is fresh," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "They must have been here, only days ago." Jacques nodded slowly, a knot tightening in his gut. "Then where are they now?" No one answered. As evening fell, they made the uneasy decision to stay within the village for the night. The lodges offered better shelter than the open woods, and though every instinct urged them to move on, fatigue and a growing sense of resignation weighed heavily on them. They built a small fire in the center of the gathering place, its flames licking faintly at the encroaching dark. Jacques sat alone for a time, watching the smoke curl upward into the dusk. His mind wandered to the stories he had heard in his youth, tales of lost tribes, of phantom villages swallowed by the earth or spirited away by ancient forces. He had dismissed them then, as any practical man would. Now, in the heart of this forsaken land, such tales no longer seemed so distant from the truth. As the fire burned low, a soft sound stirred the air. At first, Jacques thought it the wind, a low, rhythmic murmur rising and falling like a song half heard. But as he listened, he realized it was something else entirely, a chant, soft, distant, carried on the night air from somewhere beyond the village. He stood slowly, motioning for the others to stay. With careful steps, he moved toward the edge of the clearing, where the trees gathered thick and close. The chant grew clearer as he walked, a haunting melody, low and mournful, sung in a tongue he could not understand. It rose and fell like the breath of the earth itself, weaving through the branches in an endless, sorrowful refrain. Jacques pressed forward, each step deliberate, his heart thudding against his ribs. The trees parted into a small glade bathed in moonlight. At its center stood a ring of stones, worn smooth by countless years. Within the ring, a figure knelt, a woman, her hair flowing like a dark river over her shoulders, her face lifted toward the sky. Her voice carried the song, each note threading through the air with a fragile beauty that held Jacques frozen in place. He watched, transfixed, as the woman's chant wove around him, drawing forth images in his mind's eye. Visions of forests teeming with life, rivers alive with laughter and song, villages vibrant with the pulse of a people rooted in the heart of the land. And then, the shadow. The slow, creeping pall that stole breath, broke bonds and silenced voices. The song shifted, softening into a single note that hovered, trembling in the air. The woman lowered her head, her voice falling to a whisper. Jacques felt a profound sorrow fill the glade, a mourning deeper than words could reach, and then silence. The woman rose slowly, her movements graceful, almost unreal. She turned her head slightly as though sensing Jackie's presence. Their eyes met across the moonlit space, a single moment of quiet recognition. No fear, no anger. Only a shared understanding, as deep and silent as the river's flow. Without a word, she turned and walked into the shadows, her form melting into the embrace of the trees. Jacques remained standing, the echo of the song lingering in the air around him. Slowly he turned back toward the village, his steps carrying him through the hush of the forest. He felt the weight of the song within him now, a song not of despair alone, but of remembrance. A lament for a world slipping into shadow, and a silent plea for it not to be forgotten. That night, beneath a sky veiled in silver mist, Jacques Lemire dreamed of voices carried on the wind, voices that would linger long after his own had faded into the endless hush of time. By the time dawn stretched its pale fingers over the horizon, the air had grown colder, as though the earth itself recoiled from the touch of morning. Jacques Lemire awoke in the hollow stillness of the abandoned village, the embers of their fire reduced to faint glows beneath a bed of ash. Around him, his companions stirred in quiet disquiet, none daring to speak of the strange calm that seemed to hang ever heavier over their encampment. They broke their fast with hard bread and dried venison, chewing in silence, their eyes darting often to the edge of the forest, where the shadows of dawn still clung stubbornly to the trees. Jacques said nothing of what he had seen, the woman in the glade, the haunting song, but its echo remained lodged in his chest, a soft ache that refused to fade. There were things a man could not share, not for fear of disbelief, but because they belonged to a realm beyond words. As the sun struggled to rise, they prepared once more to depart. They loaded their canoes, their hands moving with practiced efficiency, but none of the usual banter. The village remained as they had found it, silent, waiting, caught in a perpetual pause between presence and absence. Jacques cast one last glance at the largest lodge before stepping into his canoe. It stood quiet, its doorway yawning like an open mouth, a silent witness to a world's slow unraveling. They pushed off from the shore, the water parting softly beneath their paddles, and drifted southward once more. Hours passed, marked only by the rhythmic dip and pull of oars and the steady procession of trees slipping past. The river here grew narrower, its course winding like a serpent through thick woods whose branches arched overhead, turning the world into a dim tunnel of shifting shadows. It might have been beautiful once, an untouched corridor of nature's quiet grandeur, but now it felt oppressive, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against them from every side. At midday, they came upon a fork in the river where a great oak stood sentinel at the water's edge, its roots clawing into the soft earth like skeletal fingers. Here the air grew strangely still, as though the very current hesitated to choose its path. Jacques motioned for the men to pause. They drifted in uneasy quiet. Mathieu, seated behind Jacques in the leading canoe, spoke first. "Which way?" Jacques studied the two channels. To the left, the river wound into a thicket of dark pine, its waters slow and heavy. To the right, it opened slightly, the sun casting faint beams upon a stretch of marshy land beyond. Neither seemed more inviting than the other. But then Jacques noticed something. Along the right bank, barely visible amid the reeds, stood a line of stones, flat, weathered, set upright at even intervals. Markers, the kind placed by the native tribes to denote sacred ground or places of warning. His heart tightened. "We take the left," he said quietly. No one argued. They turned their canoes, dipping into the darker channel, the pines looming overhead like silent sentinels. The water moved sluggishly here, thick with fallen needles and the faint shimmer of decayed leaves. The air smelled of damp earth and resin, mingled with something else, a faint, bitter tang that Jacques could not name but that set his teeth on edge. As the hours wore on, the oppressive silence deepened. Even the wind seemed to have abandoned this place. The men's paddles moved with increasing caution, their eyes flicking constantly to the banks, half expecting shapes to emerge from the shadows. Then, as they rounded a bend, they saw it. At first, it seemed merely a fallen tree across the water, a great limb draped in moss and tangled vines. But as they drew closer, the truth became horribly clear. It was a canoe, upturned and half-sunken, its sides splintered and darkened by time. And beyond it, scattered along the bank, lay remnants of another camp. Broken baskets, a torn blanket caught in the roots of a tree, a hunting spear snapped clean in two. Jacques signalled for the men to halt. They sat in stillness, the water lapping gently against their hulls. The camp was old, perhaps weeks, perhaps longer, but the sense of disturbance remained fresh, like a wound that refused to heal. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, only the eerie emptiness of a life abandoned in haste. Matthew muttered softly, his voice barely more than a breath. Why would they leave everything like this? Jacques did not answer. He felt it again, that same chill, that same suffocating sense of absence, as if the forest itself bore witness to a silent vanishing. He stepped lightly onto the bank, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The others followed, weapons drawn, though none truly believed they would need them. They moved among the remains of the camp, each man searching, though none spoke of what they hoped or feared to find. At the edge of the clearing, Jacques knelt beside a half-buried bundle, its cloth faded and threadbare. He lifted it gently. Inside were small hand-carved figures, dolls fashioned from cornhusk and wood, their faces inked with simple lines. A child's toy. Left behind in the flight, his chest tightened painfully. He rose, cradling the bundle in his hands, and stared into the forest beyond. The trees swayed faintly in a breeze he could not feel. Somewhere far off, a crow called, harsh, abrupt, as though breaking the spell of silence. He turned back to his men, the weight of the forgotten child's toy pressing against his palms. They met his gaze, their faces pale, eyes dark with shared unease. There was no need for words. They all felt it, the creeping certainty that they were not merely witnessing a mystery, but moving within its grasp. As they prepared to leave, Jacques placed the bundle gently beneath the roots of a great pine, tucking it into the earth with a quiet reverence. A gesture of respect, or perhaps of apology. They pushed off once more, their canoes gliding soundlessly down the dark channel. And as the trees closed in behind them, Jacques could not shake the feeling that the forest watched with eyes unseen, and that with each stroke of the paddle, they drifted deeper into the heart of a vanishing world whose silence sang louder than any voice they had ever known. By the 15th day of their silent odyssey, the river had narrowed into a shadowed corridor, its course winding through a labyrinth of swamps and dense undergrowth. The air grew thick with the scent of stagnant water and decaying leaves, a miasma that clung to the skin and seeped into the fabric of their clothes. Overhead, the canopy pressed low, tangled branches weaving a web of gloom that filtered the light into pale, trembling fragments. Jacques Lemire paddled at the front of the lead canoe, his movements slow, measured, as though each stroke disturbed not just the water but the very air around them. Behind him the men followed in hushed obedience, their faces pale and drawn. Whatever bravado or curiosity they had brought with them had long since drained away, replaced by a quiet dread that wrapped itself around their hearts like an unseen vine. They had not seen another soul since the forsaken camp, nor had they spoken of the strange artifacts, the vanished people, or the unsettling quiet that now seemed to follow them with relentless patience. Even the wildlife had grown sparse, the occasional heron standing motionless in the shallows, the fleeting glimpse of a deer vanishing between the trees. But always silent, always distant, as though the land itself recoiled from their presence. By midday, they reached a clearing where the river widened slightly, a rare opening beneath the pressing arms of the forest. The water here pooled into a slow, swirling eddy around a flat, moss-covered rock that jutted out from the bank like the prow of a ship. Jacques signalled for a pause, and the men let their canoes drift idly as they gathered their breath. It was then that Jacques noticed the carvings. Etched into the surface of the rock were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of shallow symbols, worn by time yet still discernible. Spirals, handprints, interwoven lines that seemed to dance and twist beneath the shifting light. They covered every inch of the stone, their patterns overlapping in a way that felt less like decoration and more like a record, or a warning. Jacques leaned forward, his fingertips brushing lightly over the cool stone. The grooves felt deep, purposeful. These markings had been placed here with care, not in haste. He traced the spiral of one symbol, a circle within a circle, lines radiating outward like the ripple of a stone dropped into water. Matthew drifted closer in his canoe, his voice a quiet murmur. "What do they mean?" Jacques shook his head slowly. "I don't know." But even as he said it, a strange thought crept unbidden into his mind. What if they were not meant to be understood? What if these symbols were not messages for the living, but for something else entirely? As they lingered, a faint breeze stirred the air, carrying with it a low hum. Not a sound, precisely, but a vibration felt deep within the chest, as if the earth itself exhaled beneath their feet. The men grew still, eyes wide, as the hum faded into silence once more. Jacques stood slowly, scanning the woods beyond the clearing. Nothing stirred. The trees stood silent, their shadows long and unmoving. Yet the sensation remained, that quiet, pulsing hum echoing in his blood. They did not speak of it. Instead, they moved on. The river bent sharply eastward, leading them deeper into the heart of the swamp. The air grew heavier, the light dimmer. Strange growths clung to the trees, thick ropes of moss, pale fungi like ghostly fingers creeping up the trunks. The water darkened, its surface broken occasionally by drifting mats of weeds that floated like patches of green skin upon a dark, bottomless lake. By nightfall, they made camp upon a narrow strip of dry land hemmed in by water on three sides. They lit no fire, though the cold gnawed at their bones. No one wished to draw attention. Instead, they sat close together, wrapped in cloaks and silence, each man staring into the growing dark as though awaiting some unspoken verdict. Jacques sat apart, his gaze fixed upon the slow swirl of mist rising from the water's edge. The carvings on the stone haunted his thoughts, their silent language, their echo of forgotten hands scratching warnings into an indifferent world. He wondered who had made them and why. A soft splash drew his attention. He turned his head, eyes narrowing in the gloom. At the edge of the mist, something moved, slow, deliberate. A shape, half seen, slipping through the shadows just beyond the bank. Human, or almost human. He rose quietly, his movements slow, careful not to startle whatever watched from the dark. The shape paused, its form wavering like a reflection on disturbed water. Then, without sound or gesture, it slipped back into the fog and was gone. Jacques stood motionless, his heart a slow, steady thrum in his chest. He felt no fear, only a deep, ineffable sadness, a sense that whatever had watched them was neither threat nor friend, but something older, a witness to the slow unraveling of the world. Behind him, the men huddled close, speaking in low, uneasy whispers. He returned quietly, settling beside them without a word. The night passed in restless silence, each man alone with his thoughts, the weight of the unknown pressing down upon them like a silent shroud. When the pale light of morning finally seeped through the mist, they rose without command, gathering their belongings with a quiet urgency. They pushed off from the shore, the soft dip of their paddles breaking the glassy surface of the water once more. And as the swamp closed around them, Jacques Lemire felt the quiet certainty settle into his bones, that whatever fate awaited them beyond the narrowing river, it was no longer merely a mystery to be solved, but a truth to be endured. A truth written not in words, but in the silent song of a land slowly forgetting its children and of travellers caught in the echo of a vanishing world. The 16th morning greeted them not with sunlight, but with a dense, suffocating fog that lay thick upon the river, swallowing the world in a pale, formless hush. Jacques Lemire stood at the bow of his canoe, his eyes straining into the white void, as though searching for the edge of a dream from which none could wake. The air felt damp and close, every breath heavy with the scent of moss and brackish water. The men paddled in near silence, the faint drip of water from their oars the only sound in a world gone mute. Even the birds, those restless heralds of dawn, offered no song. The fog pressed upon them like a living thing, wrapping the world in a damp, muffling embrace. The river itself vanished into a colourless blur, leaving them adrift in a space where time seemed suspended and distance meant nothing. Hours passed, or what felt like hours, marked only by the rhythmic pull of paddles and the steady beat of their hearts. Jacques could feel the tension in the air, the tight coil of nerves wound silently within each man. They had entered a place where nothing lived, and yet everything watched. A faint splash echoed from somewhere within the mist. Instantly the men paused, their paddles hovering over the water. Eyes darted into the shrouded distance, straining for a glimpse of what had stirred. But there was nothing, only the pale blur of fog and the slow ripple of water lapping against their canoes. Mathieu whispered from the rear, his voice low, barely audible. "It's following us." Jacques said nothing. He did not need to ask what it was. They had all felt it, the presence, the silent witness that hovered always just beyond sight, neither chasing nor retreating, only watching with patient, indifferent eyes. They moved on. By noon, the fog began to thin, peeling away like a slow, reluctant curtain. The world emerged in fragments, the shadow of a tree, the glint of water, the dark outline of reeds swaying softly at the banks. They drifted into a broad basin of the river, where the water spread wide and still, reflecting the pale grey of the sky above. At the centre of the basin stood an island, small, flat, its surface bare save for a single towering tree. It rose stark against the sky, its limbs blackened and twisted, leaves sparse as though scorched by some unseen hand. The roots clawed at the water's edge, half submerged in the soft mud of the island's shore. Jacques felt his breath catch. At the base of the tree sat a circle of stones, much like the one they had seen carved with symbols days before. But this circle was different. Where the earlier carvings had felt ancient and worn, these were fresh, the lines sharp, their symbols raw against the stone's pale surface. And within the circle something lay draped upon the ground, a bundle of cloth, dark and still. Without a word, Jacques guided his canoe toward the island. The men followed, silent as shadows, their eyes fixed upon the strange tableau before them. The water was shallow near the shore, and they stepped lightly from their canoes, boots sinking into the soft earth. Jacques approached the stone circle, each step slow, deliberate, a quiet reverence or perhaps dread guiding his movements. The bundle was a body, small, wrapped tightly in dark fabric, bound with strips of woven grass. A child, no older than 10, cradled within a shroud of silent farewell. The face was hidden, the hands folded neatly across the chest. A simple necklace of carved bone rested atop the cloth, an offering perhaps, or a token of remembrance. Jacques knelt beside it, a hollow ache pressing at his chest. He did not touch the bundle. Instead he bowed his head, a silent gesture of respect, though he knew no words, no prayer from his tongue could serve here. Mathieu stood beside him, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Why leave a child here?" Jacques lifted his eyes to the tree, its branches stretching gnarled and empty toward the sky. "Not left," he murmured, "given." The words hung in the air, soft but heavy, settling upon the hearts of the men like the weight of earth upon a grave. They remained there for a time, silent beneath the gaze of the dead tree, until Jacques rose and turned away. They left the island as they had come, quiet, solemn, their canoes sliding gently back into the embrace of the river. The fog closed behind them once more. That night, they camped on a narrow strip of land where the river split into thin, twisting channels. They built no fire. The cold pressed close, but none spoke of lighting a flame. The shadow hung too near now, its presence wrapping around them like a silent veil. They sat huddled in their cloaks, their eyes watching the dark, each man lost within the fortress of his thoughts. Jacques sat apart, staring into the night where the river whispered among the reeds. The image of the child upon the island clung to him, so small, so silent. A life folded away, wrapped in cloth and left to the care of a land that had forgotten how to mourn. He wondered if the people had placed the child there in hope or in surrender. A soft breeze stirred the water's surface, carrying with it the faintest sound, a hum, low and mournful, drifting upon the air like the echo of a forgotten song. Jacques closed his eyes. For a moment he felt as though he, too, sat within the stone circle beneath the dead tree, a silent offering in a world grown too tired to remember. And in the quiet that followed he understood, with a sorrow as deep as the river itself, that they were no longer witnesses to a fading people. They were mourners at the edge of a vanishing world. The 17th day dawned beneath a sky veiled in thin, colourless clouds, casting a pallid sheen over the still waters of the winding river. Jacques Lemire and his men moved without haste, their bodies wearied beyond mere fatigue, as though the silent weight of the vanished world pressed invisibly upon their shoulders. The rhythm of paddles dipping into water had become less a motion of travel and more a ritual, a slow, persistent march deeper into a land that had grown indifferent to their presence. They spoke little now. Even Mathieu, once quick with words and wary jokes, sat silent at the rear of Jacques' canoe, his eyes hollow and fixed upon the shifting patterns of the water. Conversation had become a memory, like the echo of laughter fading from a long-forgotten hall. The river offered no company but its own slow murmur. By midday, the land opened into a low marsh, a vast expanse of reed-choked water stretching beyond sight, its surface mottled with floating islands of moss and tangled roots. The sky pressed low, heavy and oppressive, mirroring the flat grey of the waters below. The air was thick with the scent of brine and damp rot, a suffocating reminder that this was a place where life clung to the edges of existence. They paddled onward, threading their way through narrow channels where the water ran dark and sluggish. Now and again they glimpsed strange shapes adrift in the marsh. A canoe half sunken, a woven basket caught in the branches of a half-drowned tree, a lone feather floating aimlessly upon the surface. Each object, simple and mundane, became a silent relic of a vanished presence, left behind like the faint traces of breath on a mirror. As they rounded a bend in the narrow channel, Jacques felt his paddle catch against something beneath the water. He halted, signalling the others with a silent gesture. Slowly he leaned over the edge of the canoe, peering into the dark depths. At first he saw only the reflection of the overcast sky wavering upon the surface. But as his eyes adjusted, a shape emerged, a pale curve just beneath the waterline, motionless, silent. He reached down cautiously, his fingers breaking the surface with a soft ripple. It was a mask, wooden, carved in the likeness of a human face, its features stark and expressionless. The eyeholes stared blankly upward, their dark voids seeming to drink in the light. The paint had faded, its colours bled away by time and water, leaving behind the ghost of a visage half-remembered. Jacques lifted it gently, water streaming in rivulets from its edges. The mask was light in his hands, its surface worn smooth by years of handling, or perhaps by the silent caress of the river itself. He turned it slowly, tracing the contours of its empty gaze. Matthew spoke softly behind him. "A funeral mask?" Jacques did not answer. He stared into the hollow eyes, feeling a strange sensation, an echo of something vast and silent pressing against the edges of his mind. The mask seemed not merely an artifact, but a silent witness to a world slipping quietly into shadow. Without a word, he placed it gently at his feet in the canoe and resumed paddling. They moved deeper into the marsh, the landscape folding around them in endless loops of water and reed. Time seemed to dissolve into the slow drift of the current, their journey becoming less a passage through space and more a quiet surrender to the will of the land. As evening approached, they found a stretch of firm ground, a narrow rise amid the endless marsh. They made camp there, though no fire was lit. The light was fading, a soft grey dimming into blue, and with it came the quiet hum that had begun to haunt the edges of Jack's hearing, a faint, low resonance like the echo of distant voices just beyond comprehension. He sat with the mask upon his knees, tracing its worn lines with calloused fingers. The others lay nearby, some in restless slumber, others staring blankly into the deepening dark. The air was cool, heavy with mist, the night's silence deep and unmoving, and then, softly, faintly, a voice. Jacques' head snapped up, his heart a sudden thud in his chest. He turned his gaze toward the water's edge, where the marsh stretched into a veil of mist. The voice came again, soft, lilting, neither male nor female, a single word spoken in a language Jacques did not know. He rose quietly, stepping toward the sound. The reeds swayed gently, parting before him as he moved to the water's edge. And there, standing upon the shallow bank, was a figure, a woman, her form slender and cloaked in a garment of pale, flowing cloth. Her hair hung loose about her shoulders, dark as the marsh's shadowed depths. She stood with her head tilted slightly, eyes fixed upon Jacques with an expression neither curious nor cold, but deeply, achingly sad. Jacques felt his breath catch in his throat. She spoke again, soft, musical, the same word repeated, her voice threading through the air like the echo of a distant song. Though he could not understand the word, its meaning seemed to settle deep within him, as though carried on a current of memory beyond his own. He stepped forward, his heart pounding. But before he could speak, the woman turned, her form dissolving into the mist with a grace so fluid it seemed she melted into the very air. The reeds swayed softly in her wake, the water falling silent once more. Jacques stood motionless for a long moment, the echo of her voice lingering in the hush of the marsh. Then, with a slow breath, he returned to the camp, the mask still clutched in his hand. That night, As the men lay in uneasy slumber, Jacques sat alone beneath the fading stars, the mask upon his knees and the woman's soft voice weaving through the silent chambers of his heart. And as he watched the dark waters shift and sigh beneath the pale shimmer of moonlight, he knew beyond doubt that they had crossed a threshold from which no words, no maps, no prayers could guide them back. The 18th dawn crept slowly over the marshlands, its pale light filtering through a sky that seemed less a canopy and more a thin veil separating the living from something far older, far quieter. Jacques Lemire rose from his restless slumber, the damp earth cold against his skin, the soft hum of the marsh pressing faintly at the edges of his senses. The mask rested beside him, its hollow eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of the morning mist. They moved without words. The men packed their few belongings with silent efficiency, their movements slowed not fatigue alone but by the unspoken understanding and that whatever awaited them deeper within these marshes, it was not meant to be witnessed. Yet they went forward, not by command, nor by the lure of discovery, but by the quiet pull of something vast and inescapable. Curiosity had long since surrendered to a deeper instinct, a need to see, even as they feared the seeing. The river narrowed once more, winding into channels so slender they barely permitted the canoes to pass. The trees grew taller here, their roots gnarled and half-submerged in the black water, their branches twisting skyward like the fingers of drowned giants reaching for a light that refused to come. The air was thick with a scent Jacques could not name, a mingling of earth, water, and something faintly metallic, like blood diluted in 1,000 streams. By midday, the sound returned. It began as a faint hum beneath the water, a soft, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate within the bones rather than the ears. Jacques felt it first, the subtle tightening of his chest, the faint prickling at the base of his skull. He glanced at Matthew, whose eyes flicked toward him, wide and uncertain. Then came the voice. A single note, low and sustained, rising from the mist in a cadence so pure, so achingly familiar, that Jack's heart seized in his chest. It was the same voice, the one he had heard at the water's edge, the soft, wordless song that seemed to belong neither to this world nor the next. They drifted in silence, their paddles stilled, as the voice wove its way through the air. It was not loud, nor even near, but it filled the space around them with a presence both tender and unbearable. It was a song of sorrow, of farewell, a lament that spoke of endings older than memory, of loss deeper than the graves of forgotten nations. The men sat motionless, eyes wide, their faces pale in the soft, diffused light. No one spoke, no one moved. They merely listened, hearts held in thrall by a melody not meant for their ears. As the song faded into the hush of the marsh, Jacques became aware of something else, a shape emerging through the mist ahead. At first, it seemed a trick of the light, a ripple upon the water's surface, but as they drifted closer, the form solidified. A canoe, long and narrow, gliding silently toward them. It carried a single occupant, a man tall and thin, his skin pale beneath the shadows of a dark hooded cloak. His hands rested lightly upon a paddle he did not use, for the canoe moved without his touch, sliding gently over the water as though borne upon a silent current known only to him. His face was hidden, his posture still, save for the slow tilt of his head as he regarded them with a gaze Jacques could feel rather than see. The air grew colder. The man's canoe drifted past theirs with slow, deliberate grace. He said nothing, he made no gesture. But as he passed, Jacques felt the soft brush of a presence, not of threat nor of malice, but of something deeper, more terrible, acceptance. An understanding passed between them in that silent moment, an acknowledgement that the travellers were no longer guests nor intruders. They were part of this now. Jacques turned slowly, watching as the silent figure drifted into the mist once more, his form dissolving like a shadow at the edge of waking. When the figure vanished completely, Jacques faced forward again, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. They paddled onward, the song lingering in their hearts like the fading warmth of a dying fire. By late afternoon, they reached a stretch of river where the waters ran wide and still, reflecting the pale sky with unnerving clarity. Here the trees pulled back, giving way to a hollow plain of grass and scattered stones. It should have felt like a respite, a clearing after endless days of oppressive forest, but instead It carried an emptiness that struck deeper than any shadowed wood. At the center of the plain stood a single, ancient stone. It rose from the earth like a tooth from the gums of a long-dead beast, weathered by wind and rain, its surface marked with deep, deliberate carvings. Unlike the symbols they had seen before, those spirals and handprints lost to time, this stone bore a single massive image, a face. Not human. Its features were broad and angular, eyes hollow and deep, mouth open in a silent scream or song. The expression was neither anger nor fear, but something beyond both, a raw, unfiltered anguish carved into stone, a testament to a sorrow that predated all memory. Jacques disembarked, his steps slow as he approached. The air around the stone hummed faintly, vibrating with a resonance he felt in the marrow of his bones. He reached out, laying a hand upon its cold surface. The stone felt alive beneath his touch, not warm, nor pulsing, but aware, as though it remembered every hand that had touched it, every life that had passed beneath its gaze. Matthew stood beside him, his voice a whisper. "What is it?" Jacques did not answer. He knew it was a marker, not of land nor of passage, but of loss, a monument to a vanishing people, a silent scream cast in stone, so the earth itself would never forget the song of those who once called this place home. That night they camped at the stone's base, their fire a faint, flickering ember against the vastness of the empty plain. Jacques sat with the mask upon his knees, staring into the hollow eyes of a face that had watched countless lives fade into shadow. And as the stars wheeled silently overhead, he understood at last that they were not merely travellers upon a dying land. They were witnesses to a requiem sung in silence, a song that would echo through the bones of the earth long after the last voice had fallen quiet. The gentle hush of dawn spilled across the eastern forests, casting long shadows over the mossy earth where once quiet feet had trodden paths now overgrown with thickets. The morning air hung still, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp soil, a silent echo of the lives once woven so intricately with this land. The story of their vanishing lingered like mist among the tall trees, too fragile to seize yet impossible to forget. In the silent glades of the northern woodlands, tales were whispered of the Huron tribes, known for their strong alliances and intricate networks of trade. They lived by the grand rivers that shimmered like veins of silver across the green expanse. Their villages were bustling with the gentle hum of daily life, women weaving mats, elders sharing stories, and children chasing the wind. The Hurons were adept diplomats, often mediating between neighbouring tribes. Yet, as the 17th century pressed onward, the shadow of war and unseen pestilence crept over their lands. It began subtly, as many endings do. A faint cough among the women, a rash upon a child's skin, seemingly harmless signs that were brushed aside as trifles of the season. But then, as weeks unfurled into months, the coughs grew deeper, more ragged, until they silenced voices altogether. The once vibrant villages dimmed under the weight of an unseen spectre. The Huron people, who had weathered countless winters and rivalries, found themselves unable to shield against this silent foe. European traders spoke in hushed tones about the Great Sickness, a plague that moved faster than armies and with deadlier resolve. It was smallpox, an unwelcome guest in a world that had never known its cruelty. Carried in the breath of traders, in the weave of traded cloth, in the unseen particles of the air itself, it slipped quietly into the heart of villages and claimed them without warning. The Hurons, weakened by their attempts to defend against the relentless Iroquois confederacy, found themselves assailed not by blades but by disease. The Iroquois, fierce and strategic, had long been at odds with the Hurons. But now even their battle cries fell softer upon ears, dulled by the mourning of entire families gone in a single season. The forests, once alive with the sounds of daily life, fell silent, save for the somber crackle of funeral pyres. Further to the south, in the fertile valleys where the Mississippian cultures had once risen, stories unfolded with a chillingly similar refrain. The grand cities, metropolises of mound builders who had crafted temples reaching toward the heavens, stood eerily empty. Cahokia, the city that once held tens of thousands beneath its earthen pyramids, became a hushed echo of its former self. The people who built it faded before the arrival of chronicled history, leaving behind mounds and mysteries that whispered only in the rustle of prairie grasses. As European settlers pushed deeper into the heartland, they encountered lands strangely void of inhabitants. Villages that had once thrived now bore only skeletal frames of longhouses, their inhabitants gone without a trace. The forests reclaimed what had been theirs, vines twisting over hearthstones, the songs of birds replacing human laughter. To the settlers, it seemed a providence, a land left for them by some divine decree. They could not fathom, or perhaps chose not to fathom, the silent catastrophe that had cleared the path before them. The Spanish, upon their relentless march through the southern realms, noted similar patterns among the tribes of the southeast. The mighty chiefdoms that had resisted Hernando de Soto's brutal expeditions were found decades later to be shadows of their former strength. Villages lay abandoned, their fields overgrown, their people scattered or succumbed to the invisible enemy that rode with the wind. Among the whispers of scholars and chroniclers, questions lingered. Was it solely disease? Or had the web of causes stretched deeper, woven from threads of conflict, displacement, and the slow erosion of cultures under foreign pressures? The puzzle remained incomplete, each piece a testament to the unfathomable loss endured by those whose voices could no longer tell their own tales. In the frozen expanses of the north, even the stoic Inuit and their neighboring tribes felt the creeping touch of change. Though their isolation spared them from the worst of the plagues, their traditional ways faced new strains. The fur trade, that shimmering lure dangled by European hands, disrupted ancient trade routes and rivalries. Skirmishes flared in places once peaceful, and dependence on foreign goods crept quietly into daily life. The interconnectedness of native societies, once their strength, became a vector for shared suffering. Trade paths that carried beads and stories now carried sickness and sorrow. The very web that had bound them together in peace became a fragile net frayed by external pressures and internal despair. Yet, amidst this quiet unraveling, there remained sparks of endurance, faint but unyielding. Tribes like the Powhatan Confederacy on the eastern seaboard, though battered by conflict and disease, clung fiercely to their identity. Their resistance, though ultimately overrun by the relentless tide of colonial ambition, stood as a testament to the indomitable will of a people fighting not just for land, but for memory and meaning. The shadow of extinction did not fall evenly nor entirely. In the western deserts and along the high plateaus, tribes adapted with quiet resilience. The Navajo and Apache learned the ways of the horse, turning an imported creature into a tool of survival and power. Their migrations, once bound by foot, stretched further across the sweeping plains, reshaping the cultural tapestry of the West. But in the hearts of those early chroniclers, a somber reflection began to take root. The mystery was not merely why they disappeared, but why they seemed fated to vanish before the eyes of those who arrived after them. Had it been a predetermined destiny written by nature, or a tragedy carefully inked by human hands, greed, fear, and a thirst for dominion? The forests whispered no answers. The rivers carried no confessions. Only the empty hearths, the silent villages, and the faded trails remained, a quiet testament to lives lived, lost, and too often forgotten. The mystery of their extinction hung not in the shadows of speculation, but in the silent weight of absence, a heavy hush upon a land once vibrant with voices now turned to whispers on the wind. As twilight settled upon the vast frontiers of the American continent, casting long golden streaks across the undulating plains and shadowed forests, another layer of the silent mystery unfolded. A chapter shaped not by the clash of swords or the creeping advance of disease alone, but by the subtle erosion of hearts and hopes under the unrelenting pressure of foreign dominion. In the heart of the Great Lakes region, where the waters shimmered like molten glass beneath the setting sun, the Ojibwe people moved gently along ancient portage routes, their birch-bark canoes gliding over mirror-like surfaces. They were among those who first encountered the encroaching presence of European traders. With them came goods of wonder, beads, iron tools, woven cloths of vibrant hues, and beneath these gifts, a fragile thread of dependence began to weave itself into the tapestry of Ojibwe life. The fur trade became a silent battleground, not of blood but of influence. The French, keen to establish alliances, introduced new patterns of exchange, threading themselves into the fabric of tribal politics. At first, these alliances seemed harmless, even beneficial. But beneath this veil of commerce, a deeper tide swelled, one that would slowly change the heartbeat of native societies. The exchange of furs for foreign goods shifted the balance of power among tribes. Old rivalries were rekindled with newfound weapons, muskets replacing bows, steel knives gleaming where stone once cut. The Iroquois, emboldened by firearms, launched devastating raids upon neighboring nations, altering the ancient rhythms of conflict. The famed Beaver Wars raged across the northeast, transforming alliances and decimating populations, not only by blade but by the forced displacements that followed. In distant council fires, elders spoke with furrowed brows about the changing ways. The land, once a shared mother, now trembled under the weight of new demands. Beavers, hunted relentlessly to satisfy European markets, grew scarce. Territories once abundant with life became silent, their streams bereft of the creatures that had inspired legends. With the loss of the beaver came the collapse of not only an economic lifeline, but a spiritual one, as the intricate relationship between the people and the natural world frayed under unseen strains. Further south, along the winding waterways of the Ohio Valley, the Shawnee faced a creeping dread that spread not only through battlefields but into the very fabric of their identity. They were a people known for their resilience, for their capacity to return even after displacement. Yet as the years unfurled, displacement became a cruel refrain that echoed with increasing frequency. Pushed by rival tribes, pressured by colonial encroachment, and whittled by disease, they began a cycle of retreat and resistance that seemed endless. The whispers of the Shawnee tell of villages abandoned overnight, trails marked not by the joyful prints of returning hunters, but by the somber tread of families carrying all they possessed. Mothers with infants swaddled tightly, elders leaning upon carved staffs, and warriors with faces painted in silent defiance. They moved through the forests not as hunters nor as conquerors, but as shadows, seeking spaces untouched by the relentless hand of change. But even in these quieter corners, change found them. Missionaries arrived with words of salvation and promises of eternal life, dressed in somber robes and speaking with gentle, persuasive tones. Some among the native peoples listened, drawn by curiosity or the hope of respite in a world unraveling around them. Others resisted, holding tightly to the stories of their ancestors, refusing to let the old ways be swallowed by foreign tongues. This subtle war of spirits, faith against tradition, left marks as profound as any musket ball or plague. In some villages, rifts grew between those who embraced the new faith and those who clung fiercely to the old. The fabric of unity, stretched thin by external pressures, now frayed within. Quiet arguments over beliefs became loud disputes, and kin turned from one another, hearts heavy with confusion and sorrow. On the vast plains to the west, the Comanche rose like a storm upon the horizon. Masters of the horse, they transformed the open land into a domain of unmatched prowess and mobility. Yet even they, who seemed almost born of the wind itself, faced changes beyond their control. The introduction of horses had not only given them power but had drawn new rivalries. Tribes once separated by vast distances now clashed for grazing lands and hunting grounds, each seeking dominance in a landscape that grew smaller with every passing season. Trade routes, which had once been lines of exchange and mutual respect, hardened into borders marked by blood. The web of alliances tightened, then snapped, reforming with shifting loyalties as survival demanded. The heart of the plains throbbed with conflict, not only between natives and settlers, but among the tribes themselves, an intricate dance of war and diplomacy shaped by the ceaseless intrusion of foreign influences. In the dense woodlands of the southeastern territories, the rise of the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, offered a different glimpse into the native response to the shifting tides. These nations adopted aspects of European governance, built towns with European-inspired structures, and drafted constitutions in hopes of preserving autonomy through adaptation. Yet even this calculated assimilation could not shield them entirely. Laws and treaties, signed with ink and solemn handshakes, proved as fragile as leaves before the storm. Time and again agreements were broken, promises revoked, and lands seized by those who viewed ink as a mere formality before conquest. The stories of these tribes became a haunting testament to the futility of appeasement in the face of relentless expansion. As the night deepened and the stars began their silent vigil over the darkened lands, a soft question stirred in the hearts of those who watched this unfolding tragedy. Was there ever truly a choice? Had the fate of the native peoples been sealed long before the first sails pierced the horizon, before the first boot touched the soft earth of their homelands? Or was this an outcome not of destiny, but of decisions? Countless decisions, some made in fear, others in arrogance, yet all leading inexorably to this slow vanishing. The winds whispered no answers, only carrying forward the faint echoes of songs once sung in vibrant villages, now reclaimed by the forest's quiet hands. The mystery deepened, not merely in the manner of their passing, but in the silent void they left behind. A presence felt most strongly in their absence, like a ghost forever wandering a land that could no longer remember the names of its first children. The silver hush of pre-dawn mist settled across the valleys and woodlands as if nature itself mourned in silence for what had been lost. The rivers flowed, unchanged in their course, yet their banks no longer echoed with the songs of fishermen casting nets or the laughter of children at play. In this quiet hour before the sun's first touch, the land seemed suspended, held between memory and forgetting. To the west, where the tall grass prairies met the endless sky, the Lakota rode beneath the wide heavens, their silhouettes dark against the breaking light. They were a people born of movement, shaped by the wind and the wild herds that thundered across the plains. The horse had given them a freedom unknown in generations past, a freedom that came with new power and new perils alike. With mastery of the horse, the Lakota and their allied bands surged across territories once unfamiliar, expanding their reach and influence. They hunted the bison in great numbers, their way of life deeply entwined with the herds that roamed in numbers so vast they seemed as endless as the horizon itself. Yet even in this seeming abundance, shadows gathered at the edge of their world. As settlers moved westward, driven by whispers of fertile lands and golden promises, they carved new paths across ancient hunting grounds. Trails and wagon tracks cut through sacred spaces, disrupting the delicate balance between man, beast, and earth. The bison, hunted now not for sustenance but for sport and profit, began to vanish in staggering numbers. Mountains of bleached bones rose on the plains, silent monuments to greed and waste. The Lakota saw this not merely as the loss of a resource, but as the unraveling of a spiritual bond. The bison were more than prey. They were a brother, a symbol of life itself. To witness their decimation was to witness the severing of an ancient pact, a quiet betrayal by forces the Lakota could neither understand nor stop. Tension smoldered like embers beneath ashes. At first, small skirmishes flared, raids, disputes, warnings sent with arrows and powder, but the settler tide pressed on, indifferent to the language of warning. Treaties were drawn upon paper and signed with solemn hands, only to be broken as easily as promises whispered to the wind. The Lakota, like so many before them, found their words twisted, their lands taken, and their way of life pressed ever closer to the edge of oblivion. In the eastern woodlands, the echoes of other tragedies whispered among the fallen leaves. The Algonquian-speaking tribes, once masters of the forests and rivers, had seen their world diminished by waves of disease, displacement, and war. Yet their legacy endured in fragments, in the names of rivers, in the faint lines of family, remembered by descendants unaware of the full breadth of their heritage. The woods, though silent, carried the weight of their passing in every rustling leaf and shadowed glade. Stories told by elders to children spoke of a time when the world was full of voices, when the forests were alive not only with creatures of fur and feather, but with the pulse of vibrant communities. These stories, fading with each generation, became the last fragile link to a world now passed into twilight. Along the southern coasts, where the sun rose warm upon the marshlands, the Gwale and the Timucua tribes faded like footprints in the sand, washed away by the twin tides of Spanish conquest and unseen pestilence. The missions built by friars stood silent upon their departure, their bells rusting in towers now home to birds rather than prayers. The native voices that once echoed in these sacred spaces became ghosts among the cypress and the moss-hung oaks. The Spanish, in their unyielding march, left behind more than missions and ruined settlements. They left scars upon the land, scars etched in the forced labor, the decimation of cultures, and the quiet dissolution of societies once deeply connected to their lands. Even where resistance burned brightest, as with the Seminoles in the swampy fastness of Florida, it became a slow-burning fight against the inevitable weight of conquest. Yet, within this slow extinguishing, acts of defiance flickered like stars in a darkened sky. Some tribes vanished, not through annihilation but through assimilation, blending their bloodlines into new identities, hiding in plain sight among settlers, or forging mixed communities where traditions survived in whispers and secret rites. The Powhatan, the Pequot, the Yamasee, many bore this quiet resilience, refusing to vanish entirely even as their names faded from common speech. In the heart of the northern forests, the Abenaki found refuge in the deep woodlands and the rugged hills. They became shadows among the pines, their movements silent, their communities tightly knit and fiercely protective of what little remained. They endured by adapting, by learning to bend with the storm, rather than break beneath it. Their stories became woven with both sorrow and quiet pride, tales of battles fought not just with muskets and arrows but with endurance, with a silent refusal to surrender one's identity even when stripped of homeland and kin. The forests became their sanctuary, their shield against a world eager to forget them. As the decades unfurled, a strange paradox took root across the continent. The native presence, though diminished in numbers and visibility, remained deeply interwoven into the very identity of the land itself. The names of places, the trails followed by settlers, the crops cultivated, all bore the imprint of native hands and hearts. Yet the people themselves became increasingly invisible, their voices softened to whispers beneath the clamor of a growing nation. And so the mystery deepened. Not merely a question of how so many lives vanished, but of how a culture, a presence so integral to the soul of a land, could be made unseen in plain sight. It was not extinction in the sudden fiery sense, but a slow eclipse, a shadow that grew with every broken treaty, every abandoned village, every grave left unmarked. The land remembered even when men chose to forget. In the gentle sway of prairie grasses, in the quiet hush of forest glades, in the soft murmurs of rivers tracing ancient paths, the memory lingered. The story, though seldom told, waited patiently in the silence, its threads woven deep into the fabric of the continent itself. And perhaps in that waiting, there lay the truest heart of the mystery, a testament not to the vanishing of a people, but to the endurance of a legacy too deeply rooted to ever be entirely erased. Beneath the quiet dome of a starlit sky, the land of ancient America slumbered under a soft mantle of night. The forests, the plains, the rivers, and the mountains all bore silent witness to the rise and fall of countless generations, their memories folded gently into the hush of the earth. In this final telling, the mystery of the Native Americans' fading presence ripened into a soft ache, a question less about disappearance and more about transformation, survival, and the whispers that remain long after the songs have ended. Far in the northern reaches, where the boreal forests kissed the chill air of the Canadian expanse, the Cree and the Dene still walked the lands of their forebears. They adapted, as they always had, shifting with the seasons, melding ancient knowledge with the sparse offerings of the modern world. Though diminished in number, their heartbeat remained steady beneath the surface of a changing continent. They carried stories of ancestors who had faced the first contact with cautious hearts, of trade and truce and treachery in equal measure, of a relentless survival drawn from the marrow of the earth itself. In the great expanse of the Pacific Northwest, the Haida, the Tlingit, and the Coast Salish peoples wove their lives with the tides and the towering cedar forests. Their totems, those silent sentinels carved with patient hands, stood against the ravages of time and conquest. Though disease and colonial power had dimmed their numbers, their art, their spirit, and their profound connection to land and sea endured. The great canoes still sliced through the misted waters, bearing not only people but the weight of memory, of lineage, of an identity that refused to be erased. And yet, even in these enduring legacies, shadows lay thick. The systemic dismantling of native societies had been a slow, deliberate tide. Policies of removal, of assimilation, of boarding schools that tore children from their mothers' arms and pressed foreign tongues into native mouths. The Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, the long and bitter series of wars, treaties signed and then cast aside like fallen leaves, each a thread in a vast tapestry of sorrow and endurance. But this was not solely a tale of loss. In the southwestern deserts, under skies painted in hues of copper and indigo, the Pueblo peoples moved through a rhythm as ancient as the sun's arc. Their adobe villages clung to the cliffs and mesas, as they had for centuries, impervious to the erosion of time. Here the story took a different turn, not of disappearance, but of steadfast presence. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 echoed through history as a bold and brilliant defiance against Spanish colonizers, a moment when native voices roared in unity, reclaiming sacred lands and traditions, if only for a fleeting, shining time. Their survival was quiet, steadfast, woven not with the tools of war alone, but with the ceaseless practice of culture, ceremony, song, community. They passed their knowledge in soft voices beneath the vast desert stars, teaching children in whispers and dances, planting seeds both literal and metaphorical in the hard, red earth. To the northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy, Haudenosaunee remained a living testament to a sophisticated political system born long before European ships dared cross the Atlantic. Though battered by wars and fractured by colonial manipulation, the great law of peace endured among the nations. Their influence echoed far beyond their borders, whispered even into the framing of new governments by those who once called them enemies. The Longhouse still stood, both as a dwelling and as a symbol, a quiet assertion that the story was far from over. Even among those who had been displaced, scattered, or nearly erased, the embers of cultural identity glowed with quiet defiance. The rise of pan-Indian movements, the echoes of unity found in the American Indian movement, the resurgence of language programs and cultural revitalization efforts, all sang softly but persistently of a people who, though pressed to the margins, had never truly vanished. In the hearts of modern cities, where skyscrapers now pierced the skies once watched over by eagle eyes, descendants of these ancient nations walked unnoticed among the crowds. Some bore the legacy openly, others silently, carrying within them stories written in the blood and breath of forgotten villages and silent trails. They worked, they dreamed, they lived within a world that often chose not to see them, but they endured. The mystery, perhaps, was never one of extinction, but of invisibility. The narrative of disappearance served those who wished to inherit a land cleared of its original caretakers. Yet the truth lay quietly beneath that surface, a truth whispered in the beat of a drum, the soft weave of a basket, the sacred lines of a tattoo, the ancient words spoken between elders and the young. The truth was that survival took many forms, some loud, some silent, but all unyielding. In the lands where the trail of tears wound its sorrowful path, Cherokee voices rose again in song, in art, in reclaiming spaces thought lost. In the shadows of long-forgotten boarding schools, Lakota children learned the languages their grandparents were forbidden to speak. Along the winding rivers of the Pacific coast, salmon ceremonies were revived with reverent hands. In places the world had forgotten, memory took root anew. The whispering forests, the silent plains, the watchful mountains, all bore witness not to a vanishing, but to a quiet endurance beyond the grasp of conquest or forgetting. The people had not disappeared. They had endured in shadows, in silence, in the whispered strength passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. And so, in the soft hush of the night, the land itself seemed to exhale, carrying upon its breath the quiet truth hidden beneath centuries of sorrow and conquest. A truth not of endings, but of continuance. A mystery not of disappearance, but of quiet, unwavering survival. As the first light of dawn broke gently over the land, gilding the hills and forests with a golden sheen, the echoes of those ancient voices stirred once more, not as a lament for what was lost, but as a gentle reminder of what still remained, waiting patiently in the hush of the earth and the hearts of those who remembered.